Ladies and gentlemen, Tyler here is magnificent, and I always enjoy an opportunity to speak with him. Whenever I pop in at Voicecraft, seeing him makes my day. He always has something brilliant to say, something engaging, something that gets me thinking for about a week afterwards whenever he comes into the net, Voicecraft, and I always appreciate that. I love his use of language, I love his way of putting things, and I love what he adds to any conversation that he is part of. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to speak with Tyler today. Tyler, thank you for being here, sir. It's really a delight.
And I love you too.
I am hugging you. Huggle, Grace calls it, which is hug plus snuggle. So there's a huggle now through the screen there. So I hope you feel that on your shoulder, Tyler. Do you feel the warmth, Tyler, on your shoulder?
I do. And the snot and the tears of a small tear.
Yeah, that's actually part of the huggle as well. Well, Tyler,
Mm.
I wanted to ask you about your work, and I wanted to hear about your thinking and your own development and your own projects, and to ask you about that, and to have an opportunity to learn more about your thinking in those areas. So I'm just going to start on Tyler. Tell me about your work and tell me what you're thinking about these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I will. All right. So partly what I would say first is what I'm describing here is not my work. I don't want to claim ownership.
Sure, sure.
Um, in some sense, it feels like a circumferential thing.
Mm,
It's all around me. It's present everywhere. Ubiquitous is another good word for this, perhaps.
mm,
I see it not just in concentrated aspects, and by it I mean work, activity, behavior, things being done in the world. The questions of why people do what they do, right? This is so when you ask about my work, we can partition that in categories, right? My work, though, in general, is of being. Here I am, like
mm,
all the aspects of it. And so we could narrow down some aspects of it that I think are important with regards to what we find ourselves talking about in the internet here and in general. And so to that end, partly what my work feels like, and I'll just continue to use the possessive pronoun there, but it's yeah, maybe I'll broaden it to our work, right? Because
mm.
this is the point that I'm about to make, is that it is a kind of collective realization of these aspects of that which we notice and desire to relate to, but seem to be in tension with other aspects that others are wanting to be in contact with.
Mm.
And so, how it is we resolve that tension, I mean, that's been spoken about endlessly, right? Like from top to bottom, but mostly from, I think, the top. And there's been a lot of theorizing about it, and there's extraordinary. So, I'm not necessarily a trained intellectual, let's say it that way. I did work on a philosophy degree, but uh, I didn't find what they were teaching or the way that they were teaching it to be extraordinarily helpful.
Mm.
There was one teacher, um, but I've found that's true in almost all circumstances. There's like one out of hundreds perhaps that touches you or reaches you in an interesting way. And so that I'm going to hold that piece there because that's a curious aspect of
Mm. Mm.
uh, what I want to talk about ultimately in with regards to the nature of the way that we begin to divide ourselves in these activities of work and being. Okay, so uh, my work and being in this sense is to understand why I'm here, right? Why we're all here, what it is we're doing. And if I'm here doing things, what is the best thing to do in the sense of what is it that I wish to keep doing and help others keep doing so that we continually reinforce that desire to keep doing things. And how long can that go on? Now, there's a there's an old philosophical problem about the nature of attempting to ascertain like where creation came from. Is it ex nihilo or in perpetuity? Ex nihilo, I mean, doesn't really make any sense. In fact, I'm not sure how you can even explore into that necessarily. So that you get stuck with a kind of infinite recursion. Um, or, I mean, they're both deep mysteries. Spontaneous generation of ultimate order from nothing is an impossibility just as much as what it is to recall to something forever. But at the very least, if I engage in the latter instead of the former, I have something with which to continue recalling. It's partaking in the aspect of conscious being to explore that rather than to attempt to abut myself with my conscious awareness and apperception against nothing. Where do I go from there? It's like the most perfect mirror, right? There's nothing beyond it. And so the only thing that you can do is end up turning back in on yourself. So I would say, to sprinkle in a bit of like vague biographical detail, that the existence of nothingness, or the existence of the negations of all my desires, large desires like the failure of a marriage, or the change in my body that occurred when I got an autoimmune disease, these kinds of extraordinary shapings of self, right, that were outside of will, outside of control. These proposed a kind of question, which was ultimately returned back to that thing: why am I here, and what am I doing? Right? It just keeps that negation, that hard mirror, uh, gives us a point by which either we can reflect on ourselves and attempt to then become something else. This is what the energy seems to be doing, or destroy. Okay, so those are the two reactions to that, it seems like. And there's a low power state that you could kind of classify as a neutral, which is like a waiting state, right? A patience state. But that is ultimately with regards to the notion of hopeful change, I think. Uh, Usually destruction just asserts itself immediately, if not perniciously and like under the surface. I think I've generally described what it is in the vaguest of terms, some of the philosophical underpinnings for the broadest way I conceive of why I'm here talking to you, how I came here, anyways. I have been in and amongst people trying to learn why it is they do what they do, why it is I do what I do when interacting with them. And the more people I interact with of different shapes and sizes, the more I discover aspects of my being that I hadn't before, aspects of how I may think about something or how I may feel. And that exploration is unlocking a kind of awareness and understanding of those deep questions, right? And that's it has extraordinary value for it's like a primary kind of, in a basic sense. I'm not sure I can get underneath it. Good, right? Good. So that's a general sense, and now we can build up from that, right? What I noticed initially was in the framing of my own life with regards to trying to answer the questions of the two that I mentioned before. These so the failings of my marriage and the failings of my body, right? Those two things, and they were coupled. But that failure began the introspective attempt to find out the causes. And in the exploration of that, I I learned some wonderful things about the state of the world, the way that people have been wrestling with these problems for so long. I was unaware of the depth to which these things have been explored and written about. It's extraordinary. The whole thing. Like I'm much more grateful for intellectuals now, in a sense. I grew up a kind of probably a rough childhood of freedom and rebellion, riding my bike around wherever I wanted to go because home was an unsafe place, and so I guess I started off in a distinct felt sense of being in a certain kind of world, and that world had some contexts. Here's another very important one. I was raised Mormon, so and the way that people reacted to those identities, right, as they were named, began to define like an inner and an outer space, right? And that began, well, an attentiveness to it, right? A distinct awareness of an in-group and an out-group. And I noticed that all through my childhood and now adulthood. that this is continuously taking place, that people are forming in groups and breaking apart and forming in groups, breaking apart. And the reasons for why they do that are pretty diverse. So to try to tie that together, the reason why those things are important is because I wanted to understand why it is that relationships fail, period. Right? Like,
Mm.
if people start doing things together, why do they fail?
Mm.
Right? And that drove me to go onto the internet and research psychology and um, sociology and all sorts of aspects of the ways that people have been trying to answer this question. And why I found all these fascinating things. And at the same time, I had why I was coming out of a kind of profound depression associated with extreme like physical pain, being unable to use my body at all, really, just laying in bed for the most part.
Mm.
And I realized that my life was becoming something that if I looked upon it from my past self, I would have been horrified. And that I felt that horror so strongly one day. I like it was the first time I'd ever felt dread.
Mm.
I'd never felt what dread points to, but that day I felt it. It was felt like it was almost like a physical feeling of distance between where I had been and where I thought I might one day be and where I actually was.
Mm.
Debilitated, uh, bereft of family and friends and pondering existence, right?
Mm.
Whereas once I felt I had a lot of answers, given to me, by the way, right? Given to me by some pretty profound thinking um, in the Mormon religion, which we can explore. I think it's a extremely undervalued
Mm.
mind for people to look into. I don't care what your persuasion is, but what Joseph Smith was able to do, what occurred from his efforts, um, I would challenge anyone to find any pattern similar to it of its scale with regards to what comes of it. It's quite fascinating, especially in the modern era.
Mm.
But I think it has been studied by some people. The ability to produce a religion on demand, let's say, right?
Mm.
There's okay, so what I'm doing there is I'm now bringing in some other shade of context to something which is quite relevant to this part of the internet and these discussions, which is well, for Vervaeke's term, the religion that is not a religion, right? Which this collective groping that we have, and try to bring back into this awareness of the total sense of what we all are groping for, which is my work, right? That which we are all groping for. Um, that is the right relationship between each other and with ourselves,
Mm.
to find a way to be friends with ourselves rather than enemies with ourselves, right? And that desire, it's extraordinary one. It's very deep, and I'd like to try to encourage it and nourish it as much as I can, both as a father, individually in my home, and with as many people as I can bump into. And then I want to tie together as many threads of justified existence as I can. Right? There's a sense that we subdivide each other with a kind of violent tendency far more than we ever really need to. That the I mean, the word pluralism gets thrown around, but uh, we can persist as like a collective body of differentiated organs. It's entirely possible. I'm confident of this. So
Mm.
to jump to the very end, that's a significant portion of what my work is, to figure out, both in theory and in praxis, what it would look like to have a functioning human cultural body.
Mm. That was all tied together beautifully. I appreciate you sharing all that. I very much appreciate your philosophical, intellectual, and organizational interests being tied to a real felt phenomenological experience, as you know, from having a broken marriage, from having an autoimmune disease, and from that place, asking those questions of why am I here, and linking that all together, and what would that look like to carry forward. I think it is extremely important for philosophical interest and interest in general to be linked to some sort of phenomenological reference point, because otherwise it can just be based on premises or assumptions that aren't based on anything, or that are thought to be possible, that then can be pressed down, and the likelihood of it fitting becomes much less. And unfortunately, in history, it shows when people have ideas that they want to fit, they tend to assume the world is wrong, not their theory, and that creates a lot of problems. The other thing I appreciate is your emphasis on the collection of all the people working online. There's that part where T.S. Eliot borrowed from Dickens, where he says, he does the police in different voices. And it's like the wasteland is this representation of this plurality of voices to make a singularity. And I think it kind of makes me think of that image I've heard associated with Whitehead of the dewdrops on the spider web, where you have all these things connected, and these dewdrops sort of come together. And I think that's a great way to describe it. I think when you go through the, Harold Bloom, his whole book on the anxiety of influence is basically going through how all the great poets do everything in their power to deny that they have a heritage or that they were inspired. And usually the poets they say they hate are the ones they're most inspired with. And I think it's actually very important in the work done today that everyone is doing to have this acknowledgement of this spiderweb effect, and how each one of us is maybe a dewdrop of that collective, because actually the thinking will be better for it. Because another way, what you're talking about on this kind of moving between the different areas and seeing and trying to kind of feel out what are people getting at. There's this one book that I read like 8 years ago and always feel like I should read it again. But what you're speaking about reminds you that it's like the phenomenology of society. And I think it's Alfred Schultz, where he kind of warned that a lot of phenomenological analysis was individual when we needed to move to a social realm. And it's actually that social realm that would require moving between different groups, seeing what people would do, that you can see patterns that precisely because you see them reoccurring, there's a higher probability that they have something to them, some sort of substance. Now, of course, not guaranteed. There's no, you can't get that level of certainty, but that movement can give one a higher probability to say this map probably has something to do with the territory. It obviously doesn't equal the territory, but this part of it might have something going on. The other thing I wanted to say is that I very much appreciate how you're noting these failures lead to these philosophical inquiries, because and how it's in a relational context and in a physical context. Because funny enough, the thing that I always, going back, because I didn't have any professional philosophical training or anything like that, but I was always struck by how people misunderstand one another, who genuinely are trying to communicate and care about one another. Like, how was irony possible? How was misunderstanding possible? How can people who start a business together then come to the place where they hate each other more than anything? I mean, if you start a business or a marriage or a friendship, you basically think the world of this person, and yet time and time again, people get to the place where they utterly hate each other. How does that work? Because no one intends that. So what is the nature of in relationships between people that leads to that? And it's funny enough because I just appreciate what you were saying, because so many people associate philosophy with kind of being anti-relationship and anti-personal, but it was actually for me precisely watching interpersonal dynamics that made me find myself wandering into philosophy, not because I was I wanted to do philosophy. It just seemed like you kind of had to go up that way, because you had to start examining how do people interpret situations? Why do people think the way they do? Why do they feel justified in the way that they do? And so that interpersonal, and then I'll give it back to you, that interpersonal interaction was actually what led me into philosophical reasoning. And as opposed to, and I've always found that interesting, because most people associate philosophy and the interpersonal as opposites, whereas for me, one led into the other.
Well, so in a sense, in a contingency sense, all matter and energy leads into each other, right? I can follow not necessarily a causal thread, if not just a contingent one. There doesn't, well, Hmm. Okay, so abstractions and how that distances us from some of our more empirical, phenomenological based. There's something really important about that because the more abstract you get, the more unique your perspective can become.
Mm,
So I think not objective. So I use the word objective in my inner dwellings, not in a material sense, but that which has shared reality, right? That
mm.
which we share between us. That's enough, right? Like it doesn't have to have an extrinsic property or an intrinsic property. It has to
Sure.
have this relational property. Um,
Quick comment on what you're saying about objectivity. I really like that definition. Something that, just to comment on that, Jonathan Rauch in his book Kindly Inquisitors, which I think is a marvelous book, but he makes the point that objectivity is something that the observer, you could just switch people out and they'd see the same thing. And he indeed suggests that it's the shared experience that is the foundation of our sense of objectivity, not that the thing itself has an objectivity. I think that movement to relation is such a big deal because then relations become utterly necessary to increase the probability that what you're dealing with has something to do with actuality or the territory, as opposed to your own notions. So this is where the history of philosophy in being very individuated or alone or Descartes down by the oven by himself is very problematic because your best test, your best test for the substance of your thinking is in fact the reoccurrence of it through relation. I think Deleuze was getting at this with overlap. He has this language of overlapping and different differences overlapping to see patterns. I'm not sure. That seems to be what he's getting at, where in the repetition, if there's a reoccurring, that's evidence that there's something there. I'm not completely sure if I want to align that, but that notion of objectivity that you're bringing, which frankly then actually shows that relationships have a necessary, I almost want to say testing, kind of a testing function for the ideas or a reliability function that therefore if you don't deal in relationships, and that would also suggest why, that would actually suggest, and then I'll give it back to you, that tribalism is epistemologically negative. Like, and we kind of know that because of confirmation bias and people going into their own bubbles. But that's kind of the negative stuff you hear. You say, oh, if everyone's in their own tribes, they only, they reinforce one another. So you have a negative notion. I think it's important to put the positive notion forward too, where without moving between different people, you have no way to reliably test or to look for overlap or reoccurrence of your ideas. So there's both a negative reason for why tribalism is bad epistemologically, and there's a positive reason for avoiding tribalism, precisely so that you can see that reoccurrence and increase the probability that one is dealing with objectivity as opposed to one's isolated notions.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Beautiful. So all right, so let's do like a total stripping of anthropomorphic identity for a second, just deal with like a metaphysical reality. Since things exist, and we'll go back and call back on the in perpetuity thing, and they always have existed, then the game of creation then is like being in a state which is in perpetuity, right? So like if it ever stops, then it's done, and we wouldn't be here. It hasn't done that, and therefore it has this structure by which it keeps doing this. Now, if we attempt to establish, let's call it a universe, right? A cosmos, a boundary condition, and contain within it a set of rules which allows us to organize activity within it, how long can that last? That's the question. How long does the structure of those things last? And it turns out that like in a very in a very strange series of questions, if you were to contain everything in that space and then ask what's on the outside of it, you have this paradox, right? You're immediately stuck with the notions of what it is to be outside of existence, and so you wind up at having to answer, I think, that there isn't anything outside of existence, and therefore spatial extension is also infinite in the same way that time must be. So these dual infinites, and that there's other ways in which those two things relate. Now, the question is then what determines the nature of the rules within a certain given boundary condition? And what you wind up with is a microscopic and a macroscopic boundary, which has to do with the natures of the of the timing between decision states well, I don't know, without technical terms, the state of the space just in general, right? So like you have decisions which are being made with regards to the ongoing transformation of the activity, right? The verbing of it, and how those choices are made. Are you aware of Wolfram's work, Stephen
I am.
Wolfram's?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. All right. So you can conceptually map it onto that. It's kind of hypergraph, right?
Mm.
It's the basic, most basic sense you can think of are just rules, right? Engaging with each other, which are creating larger and larger structures. And if you have, let's say, simultaneous causal chains passing through this network, there's a limitation to the manner in which one can assign causality between 2 points, given the speed at which that information can be transmitted.
Mm.
Right. So there are fundamental limitations, let's say, to the pace of choice.
Mm.
Right. And that's, I think, what winds up, if we bring it back down to the human,
Mm.
you and I are riding on top of, and to, well, also to plus one your statement about the nature of bringing in that which has been our traditions and such. We are riding on top of the memory of eternity, right?
Mm.
So given that all these things have persisted throughout time, then this moment now is that which is being kind of, it's like sandwiched between this. I have some symbols I try to use to understand this, but it seems to be sandwiched between memory and possibility.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
And whatever consciousness seems to be doing is consulting the two, or navigating or transforming between the two.
Mm.
And we have these dual aspects of it, which are observation and participation. So it's an active and a passive component, which is a receiving and a giving of energy,
Mm.
right? And so that the nature of assigning a boundary condition about around like the degree to which we may actually influence a system, like so let me give you an example, a practical example. Let's say I'm a smoker and I want to quit smoking. I can say in a moment, I want to quit smoking. I can feel in that moment, I want to quit smoking, and be completely unable, given just that moment,
Right.
to choose to alter the momentum of that system.
Mm.
Right. The degree to which I can alter it isn't going to be predicated upon my sense of making the choice. It's going to be predicated upon a structure which I engage with, which reshapes the way that energy is moving in that system.
Mm.
So the manner in which I keep relating to the tobacco, right? The
Mm.
manner in which I keep purchasing the cigarettes at the store at a particular time, all that stuff has to be altered. And that is, in a most abstract sense, what I'm trying to pay attention to all the time with regards to answering that initial question you posed, which is why they fail, right? Or as we keep pointing out, why is it that we fail? And I think what happens is in every circumstance, we've taken our sense of will, our conscious assignment of a choice, and placed it outside of the context of the structure that can allow for that choice to unfold.
Mm.
And then we become frustrated, right? Because we
Mm.
assume that from that place we stand, we can actually do that. And then when we call it outside of our will,
Mm.
right? That's where we wind up eventually. And the question I have is, how is it can we properly locate our will? That's what I want to know. Where can we properly locate what we're precisely capable of doing in a given context of pacing? Like how much time it takes and the structures necessary for them to actually occur. And what winds up happening is you get these two poles, right? You get the fastest possible and the slowest possible response to that. Okay. And when you're looking out into the world, you see this also in the state of nature, the way that organisms have developed these strategies with regards to fast and slow,
Mm.
the way that they acquire resources, how quickly their metabolism functions, all of that. There's a variation in this. And that variation is also present. And this is the zinger that really drives home, and the one that I think we have to contend with, along with like probably two other major aspects. the differential in processing speed and understanding within human beings, intelligence, as we call it.
Right.
This is what seems to be a driving force behind so much of the division that exists between us, because we assign to it an extraordinary value for its predictive capacity, right? And then we define that predictive capacity as a kind of special domain because it produces enormous benefits. And then somehow we get trapped in that space. And that space becomes a kind of echo chamber, an isolated linguistic domain, a special language, right? Now, that's not bad in the sense that if that isolated linguistic domain has a special function which is able to interrelate with others, then you have a functioning cultural body, right? So if the Supreme Court can actually work with the Congress, then you have a functioning body.
Sure.
Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff.
That's magnificent. I love how you knitted that all together. So there's a few things. One, I love how you connected all of that to this question of choice. And I think typically in that, the great determinist free will debate, there's a bunch of mistakes that can occur where a lot of people can think the free will is the same as total will. Now, some people by free will may mean total will, but total free will would be free of any influence or constraints of, say, a system or determinacy, things outside your control. We're really very often, say the medievals or whatever, and this would be a different matter, when they talk about free will, it is a question of the ability to operate within the givenness that you did not choose. And it's really tied up with a teleological structure of finding fittedness. So for example, you are free to put a boat on a street, but when the boat is on the street, it actually loses freedom because it's not made to be on the street, right? It's actually made to be in the water. Sure, I can take my cup, turn it upside down, and use it as a little stool for my Lego men. I am free to do that. But there's something that's actually a loss of freedom in that, even though in a way it is a freedom, but they would say it's kind of chaos, not freedom, right? Is what they would say. Unless you're playing a game with your children and you need the stand. And that's actually an important caveat to it, because then fittedness is relative to context and intention and all of those. But that is such a big point, because you have to think about freedom and agency in an entire situation, like an entire environment. And like Blondel is so good, who nobody reads, but I thought he was great, where he talks about we need to think about freedom in terms of action, and how action is always necessarily situated in an environment, which then gets into judgment, discernment. And I think this is quite good, because then it actually gets into questions of intelligence, as you pointed out, because how we determine fittedness is then relative to the processing abilities by which to determine what is fittedness, or mechanisms of rationalization that we're capable of precisely because of intelligence, right? Intelligence can correlate with the Dunning-Kruger effect. It doesn't necessarily mean you get more correspondence. You might just be better at rationalization, right? But the problem is, as people get varying levels of processing capacities, and they're concerned about different contexts or different environments by which to exercise their agency, you absolutely have this splintering off that occurs, right? Because people determine different fittedness relative to the context that they can process themselves within, of which doesn't mesh up with the other contexts that people determine for themselves. So you have this radical splintering. Wow, that really was hard for me. Splintering that can occur that absolutely is tied to questions of processing. And you see, that would be one thing, but what's made it all the worse is we associate that IQ with hierarchy and status and ability and self-worth, right? When again, intelligence can simply be used to justify a reign of terror in France, right? Or it can be used to justify horrors. There's no necessary moral manifestation of intelligence, right? And so, there can be. One doesn't want to say intelligence is immoral, but it would be dangerous. What's the problem is where you've created so much status and kind of sense of intrinsic worth relative to IQ, that hyper accelerates the gravity of the tension between these different groups, which then leads to your political environment today, right? And then worse yet, and then I'll give it back to you, one's very capacity to understand that very large structure of interaction in of itself is a process of intellectual processing and thinking about these different things. So even seeing that entire issue is something that requires processing by which to situate, which then requires you to like, then there's this problem of saying, okay, well, how do you see that framing without being a special case of the kind of people to see that framing? And if you say, well, it's inevitable that there'd only be a special case of people that can, then whatever one does to try to get the Supreme Court and the Congress to talk together cannot be contingent upon that intellectual understanding of the situation, which is actually kind of a critique I sometimes have. Not all rationalist communities, but very often there can kind of be an idea that, well, if we just made everyone more rational, then everything would be better, right? I mean, and I don't even mean to hit the rational communities. Basically, the entire college system and education system is erected upon that. More IQ equals better democracy. Well, that can't be your solution because that is personality contingent. And also, intelligence comes after the truth you assent to. Like, you know, rationality is always in service of what you believe. You cannot get, rationality is arrived at by lived experience. You know, you were talking about your lived, that comes from belief, emotions, and all these different things. If everyone was hyper rational, you still wouldn't have unity because people have different truths by which they organize their rationality. So there's an entire, and then I'll give it back to you. So there's an entire network of assumptions that kind of undergird how people want to solve these problems of diversity and pluralism that should be questioned and unfortunately are not questioned. And I think that's where, you know, there's people that feel like, you know, it seems like people are hitting their heads on a wall or something. So everything you framed, I just think everything you said was magnificent.
Well, they do get questioned. This is what was so fascinating to me when I found out. So all right, so I had a really profound psychedelic experience. It, after, let's say it was let's call it 2016, early 2016. I had, coming out of this depression of well, it was that waiting space. It's like this is what I understood it to be now. Is a waiting for a point by which I could make some realization and transform, right? Like, and that was it. So, and one of the first sparks, interestingly enough, was and maybe you've heard of him because he's kind of a quasi shamanic guru now, is Wim Hof. I think he's run the podcast, but he has a special breathing method, and it's essentially a kind of a hyper ventilation, kind of hypoxia state, which does have, you know, an impact on consciousness in the same way that you know, well, yeah. So you change like a sense of self. So I tried it out, and I was successful, and my goal was trying to understand the nature of pain, which is an aspect of evil, let's say. So a theodicy kind of question, but it's I wanted to understand why it is that some people perceive pleasure and pain differently, right? So some people are in fact receiving pleasure from pain, as I was aware that what sadomasochism was, what was it, a human tendency. Sure. So my question was, well, what's occurring there? Well, it seems like the simplest manipulation that one can do on a value is an inversion, right? It's just an inversion, just to flip to the opposite. And so that's what I tried to do. I did this kind of meditative breathing thing where I attempted to invert the signal of pain in my mind, right? To reclassify it as something different. And it actually worked. Like it happened. Wow. Yeah, I had this, there's always a kind of profound orgasmic sense. And my hips were the worst part. And so I was concentrating on my hips, and it was in that region. So it may have been correlated in some sense, but it felt like that. It became, rather than an intense dull ache with like kind of sharpness to it, it became this like profound ecstatic feeling. And that was enough, that the shock of that when it occurred, just in my kind of very skeptical inquiry of it, was enough to kind of propel me forward in a number of directions, one of which was to call up my brother and say, hey, I've been thinking about treating depression with psychedelics. How can you help me out? And he came over that day. In fact, it was right away. It's pretty funny. Wow. It's funny, and reaching out to him, what I discovered was that he had been watching my health decline But human beings are so interesting in the way that they can desire to help others, but not know how to reach out and offer it and or ask. There are so many ways that we get stifled in that way. So in asking for his help, it unlocked something in him, and he had a profound experience as well, uh,
Wow.
engaging in the sharing and the gifting of an attempt to improve the health of another person that he loved. So I took a combination of DMT and LSD. So it was LSD, and then he gave me DMT at the peak. I assume this is something that he did on his festival circuits. He's a festival.
Oh
This is
yeah.
why I knew he.
Mm.
Yeah. So without without belaboring it too long, I had a very profound experience, which would in fact I think in some sense be irreverent of me to attempt to describe to its extent
Mm.
because of the nature of the way that it felt, the purity of that experience, which was so particular to. And okay, so I'm going to keep this thread here too. So particular. Okay, we got rid of the other one, which is the intelligences, the differential capacity. So this particular, the unicity of self, right?
Mm.
The true self, what we call the true self versus what we call the ego. And what I would say is that the difference between that is the self is that which transcends boundary conditions, and the ego is that which loves only the interior,
Mm.
right? That which it can willfully control and only willfully control.
Mm.
And that ultimately that is the difference between a terminating game and a non-terminating game
Mm.
is the isolation to a defined and static point of control, the associated psychological space we would call the ego, right? Which is
Mm.
this identification with the processes by which one can manipulate the world to achieve the ends defined within that space.
Mm.
Anything exerting itself outside of that is not self, and in fact, typically becomes an enemy of self, because if it differentiates itself from you, it's now in opposition to you because
Right.
you want it to be controlled. So what you then need is not a interior defined sense of love of self, the selfishness alone. You do need love of self, interior, but you also need love of other, right? You need love on the outside.
Right.
And so what that is an expansiveness of the nature in which self relates to other. It's that continually expanding sense of contact, contact, conscious experience with the other. And that is um, that's it's an extraordinary adventure, is what it feels like. An
Mm.
adventure
Mm.
to go out beyond the veil of what we know and control, right? To step out into the darkness, carrying with us what we have, believing in a certain kind of fundamental structure to reality,
Mm.
that there isn't some ultimate demise beyond it that is not a proper reward for our efforts, but
Mm.
believing that there's something beyond it. Now, the people that don't believe it don't ever step beyond it.
Mm.
They don't ever step beyond that which they know.
Mm.
And so there's an aspect of this, the purity of some of these sensibilities related to the idea of faith and love being that which transforms and allows for choice to exist, actual choice, right? So actual choice means newness. It means novelty.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's just a continuation of prior choices,
Right.
right?
Right.
Which is
Right.
not really a choice. So that's one of the arguments that we devolve to when we do the whole determinism thing,
Right.
which is that we imagine some like linear causal chain that we can establish, some hypothetical one, even though quantum mechanics has kind of demolished
Sure.
an aspect of that. And a lot of people are coming to recognize that. And I think there are people that have always recognized it, certainly. And there are fundamental limitations to the nature and the ways in which we can construct, let me just bring it back to this, these non-terminating games. And what that requires, and this is interestingly enough, something that was discovered by Gödel and logic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this ability to continually append to the rule set. right? So it's the participation in the formation and the creation of new rules, new ways of being. That's creation. That's actual creation. And to juxtapose these two aspects of creation, which are maybe we could call intelligence, possibility, right? It's called intelligence, possibility, and it's such a when I so, like I have such a hard time with this. I engage in like memory palace work all the time to try to keep
Mm,
track of this stuff. But the hyperdimensional object of like attempting to understand the nature of reality and all of it is it's just so crazy. It's like
yes, it is.
it's yeah, it's an ocean, right? It's an ocean in a storm. Uh
Oh yes, absolutely.
yeah. Okay. So yeah, do you want to jump in?
Dealing
Want
with
to
the
take it?
structure of reality. Well, because you like a palace, like the moment you talk about the memory palace, like Augustine talked about, there's a structure, a pre-existing structure. But actually, when you talk about like the manifold, like of the the fractal, whatever the universe, is it a fractal manifold palace? Like there's a sense in which you don't even know the metaphor by which to structure the memory movement, right? And that's part of the reason why it becomes difficult, right? Because it's like, oh, should I preset it and one thing or the other? But no, I think everything you said was beautiful. A few things. One, on the free will determinism debate. Yeah, if I hold this pen, I can choose to think about it. I am right now. I can choose to think of it as something Grace may like. I am right now. I can think of it as something that Haven might use later. I am right now. I can very freely and quickly change my thoughts about the pen and not even blink relative to what I want to think about, right? Now, I can't look over at that bookcase and think I want to see it move across the room. It will not do that, right? But I can change my thoughts. And if what I choose to do is relative to what I think and I have control over what I think, then surely I must have some degree of
But
influence on my environment.
can I insert the pace point here there?
Yes.
Because the difference is not that you can't move that bookshelf across
Yes,
the
it's the
room.
pace.
It's
That's
the
right.
amount of, yeah, it's the pace. It's like how much work will it actually take? And this is the difference between it's like magic or the way that we conceive of magic and work. This is the
Absolutely.
difference, right? It's
Yeah,
like
and I think, and that's exactly what I was going to say. See, the issue is the reason why we lose track of freedom is because you don't have the instantaneousness. But that doesn't disprove freedom. That just proves time, or the fact that freedom has to unfold through time relative to the conditions of the thing that you are operating relative to. And you
yeah.
see, that's where, yeah, you don't have total free will in the same that you can choose the pace of the movement of the bookcase and you choose if your body is involved with it or not. But there's clearly an intersection of thinking and materiality that is in operation that makes you have free will, even if not what I call total will. I make a distinction between total will, free will, and no will, right? And free will would be the ability to operate freely according to your will. Now, it's not called free matter. You're not able to freely restructure matter, but you can freely move your will within the constraints of time and space.
But again, pace. Remember pace. So like
Sure.
one of the more fascinating so I because of the nature the gift of being in the present is that you can collapse all of history, right?
Sure.
So there's this interesting, you can take the alchemists and the present state and you can see that from the development of their excursions they did in fact create the philosopher's stone.
Sure.
They did in fact, because we can in fact transmute lead into gold now. We can do this using nucleosynthesis
Sure.
techniques, using the structure, the extraordinary, exquisite structure built up off of those investigations regarding the nature in which we can construct tools that create that which we wish to see.
Oh yeah,
And
and
that's,
I'll
that's
and I'll just add, for me, it's like I cannot change the material out of the bookcase, and for me, in
no,
my immediacy, unless I go learn the alchemy within my given, this is the key for me, within my given conditionality of right now. And
yes.
this is why you see part of the problem I think that has led to a lot of these mistakes in philosophy is that we primarily think in terms of space, not time. Like, for example, there's a sense in which if I'm looking for completion, that's a term, or totality, and you were mentioning utopian mistakes before we began. There's a way in which you're looking for is for a totality in this present, like present in space, right? Well, that's not necessarily so given. But once you start talking about, well, what about relative to all of time? right? Like it is completely theoretically possible to have certain things being made present through time that cannot be made in a single moment of space, right? And so you may not, relative to this immediate moment in space, be able to say transmute lead into gold, but through time and through gaining of certain abilities or learning or whatever, you could in fact bring that about. But the problem is our brains seem to naturally associate possibility with space, not with time. And that's where we have to work through ourselves and to think, well, no, we need to define possibility more so in the unfolding through time, because that's where you can start overcoming these kind of silly debates, in my opinion, between determinism and free will. And then a lot of other things like social structure or how to in fact change your life. Like you were talking about, how can you quit smoking, right? You can't just necessarily in the moment have, bring that about. But if you think in terms of time, then you start going, how is it that I can fold or move through time so that this desire to quit smoking actually transforms the system so that I do quit smoking. And I'll give it back to you. So for me, making time primary in our thinking is just a very big deal.
Or returning an aspect of it. Yeah, there's this quote from Shakespeare that always rumbles around in my head. I think it's Macbeth or Hamlet. Hamlet, maybe. Yeah, I think it's, time hath me lord a wallet at his back, wherein he places alms for oblivion, a great sized monster of ingratitudes. Now, this relationship that we have with time is very strange. So I think you could say it that space is self and time is other in that sense. Because spatial extension or spatial awareness is that which is collected into us. We have received the state of space. Even our imaginal sense of it is what we're doing is we're constructing some aspect of awareness of a space, and so we're bringing it into self. Even the furthest distant quasars, are visible and now brought into self. But time, right? Time is that which is beyond now. It is beyond when I think of it that way. When I think of it as an othering, when I think of it as an aspect, right? It becomes an othering because it is beyond, it is the future or the past.
Right.
And I don't deal with the future or the past. I deal with the now. I deal with the present because that's where choices take place and that's where consciousness exists. It seems to be in this realm. And the nature of it is such that we are continually co-creating and participating with the perpetual searching of how it is that we can keep playing this game forever. Right? Because nothing, in a sense, I didn't finish this point before. In a sense, it was the tension between art and I'm not really sure how to classify it, what it's juxtaposed to. Maybe that'll come, but when you pointed out that when intelligent people gather together amongst themselves, what happens is intelligence coupled with reduction, right? So you have convergence and divergence in intelligence. Those are two functions of it. So you converge to a singular or you multiply possibility, right? And that when it's paired with reduction, so convergence, what it's doing then there is it's, in the sense, it's loving itself. And it becomes unable to see outside of itself because it loves itself. It reduces itself, right? It's the Ouroboros. It loops back in on itself. And so it keeps reducing to itself over and over again. Okay, so to break out of that, you have to pay attention to this idea that we are always perpetually co-creating on top of an eternal memory of, and a kind of Nietzschean kind of eternal recurrence of that which is able to always persist. And yet, if this were merely the perpetuation of that which already persisted, then nothing would be changing, right? Things are changing. And therefore, what is changing is like actual novelty. So it's an actual difference in a change of state. And so what we're doing is we're like endlessly rhyming over and over again. And every single time, it's just a little bit different. Right? It's like it's so for instance, I can make uh, laugh and gaff rhyme,
Mm.
right? And then I can start appending as many numbers or letters as I want on the front or back of either, or and on the front if we're talking about rhyming, because we
Ah.
do the rhyming at the end, right? And it doesn't matter, right? Like there's novelty, there's variation in it, but the base, that which ties it together, this relationality, this contingency, um, it remains, right? So
Mm.
there's an aspect of that ongoing co-creation of novelty, which is embedded within that desire for the people to distinguish themselves in difference within each other, which is ultimately what leads to the chaos that undermines any system which attempts to close itself off from the outside.
Mm.
Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. That's entropy.
Mm.
So if you have a membrane that is unable to allow for that to cross, then you have death.
Mm.
You have an undermining of the system, right? It perpetuates its own eating. Yeah. So in a metaphysical sense, what I'm perceiving is a kind of choice, a generalized choice space between two modes of being in this world, which is a fundamental self-eating, uh, self-defining, self-focused, self in the sense of inward turning state, which tends towards promising results, which tends towards ultimate predictions and determinism and promises of things being the way that you always want them to be. And then this other mode,
Mm.
which is which is which is sitting comfortably between the eternities, right? Between
Mm.
all that ever has been and all that ever will be, and not being so confined by my own temporary existence that I limit myself and those who I'm engaged with to, well, to what could be, to prevent what could be. Now, let me just point this one last thing out. It's not prescriptive. It's invitational. It's more like
Right.
it's not you must be this way. It is, hey, we're this way over here. Come here.
Yes.
Something like that. That seems to be the way to do it. And there are all sorts of particulars that I'd love to get into about the nature in which you can begin to make invitations, the nature in which you can create a sorting space for people to begin to co-create together um, the patterns of activity that we wish to engage in with each other. Not just take for an assumption that parts of the world, major parts of the world that we engage with are full and complete, and that our only point of contact with democracy is when we put the paper in the ballot box or when we listen to our favorite person tell us how to think or feel about something, but that there's far more within that structure that we can have our hands in and engage on, that it doesn't have to be just the, you know, the limitations of what has become a financially dominated motivational schema for making decisions, which in a sense whitewashes all of the multiplicity of choice into a singular species, right?
Mm.
To pun on a term of coinage.
I really appreciate everything you said, and I couldn't agree more. So there's a few things. One, generally, I would say that the West defines that we're going to solve all our problems with more intelligence, more IQ. If you watch the news, if you go to college, if you read the right books, if you know the right, you'll get smarter. Smarter equals we're good to go. And I don't agree with that premise. What you are saying sounds a lot of, I always talk about motivation, right? Like intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, where your motivation comes from something outside yourself versus where motivation is something internally. Now, obviously, they overlap, but the question is the dominance, or the emphasis, you could even say, right? And you see, the issue is that it's interesting because when you're closed, there's this really radical irony at the heart of it, where when you're closed off to the other, you actually become more extrinsically dependent weird
Yes.
enough.
Mhm.
Whereas when you're open to the other then comes to be identified with you and you're more intrinsically motivated. Whereas, you would think it would be the opposite, right? You would think that extrinsic motivation would make you more open, more open to the other, but actually it makes you more of a self-relating negativity. That's kind of like you're saying, this kind of a system of entropy indeed seems to be a closed off, where
Mhm.
then the self relates to the self and then it just eats itself, basically. Whereas, in the scheme of being open to the other, you see, I think this gets tied to what you were saying about the psychedelic experience or something beyond. Like it's this weird structure where if there's nothing beyond, then you're closed, and what the closed system is all there is, and so you might as well be motivated by the external world. There's no reason not to be, because that is the whole system. Whereas if there's something beyond the immediacy, well, then there's a reason to be open to the other, precisely because you cannot encapsulate that whole, right? That whole thing. And if you're closed to the other, well, then you can't possibly begin to sort of approach that or be motivated by that thing. And so for me, everything you're saying, really, resonates with me, because to me, we've looked far too much for solutions in increasing education and not enough in how people are motivated. Like their motivation to live, the ability to be their own way of carrying themselves in the world. And the reason why I think that's a big deal, because I'm a strong believer that intrinsic motivation comes from a place of openness to the other, to the unknown, to the otherness. And it's so funny, because there's a way in which intrinsic motivation sounds selfish, right? Like you're motivated by something you believe is important for yourself. That seems selfish. And actually, funny enough, it becomes very selfless, because it seems as if the individual then knows how to fit themselves in a schema with the other, where they then forget themselves. I like to talk a lot about kind of self-forgetfulness as opposed to selfish or selfless. When you're intrinsically motivated, you're so caught in the unfolding, in the development of that, necrophy as the opposite of entropy, that you're not focused on yourself. Whereas when you focus on yourself, then it's like you hurl yourself into entropy in a way. And it is funny, you can be focused on yourself either out of selfish reasons or selfless reason. Like if you're saying, oh, I'm nobody, oh, look at me, I'm not as good as other people. Well, you're actually turning inward at that point, and that's something Timothy Keller talks about that I really like. Whereas it seems like what's optimal is a kind of self-forgetfulness, which then is found in this kind of intrinsic motivation, as I like to call it, that then precisely is an openness to a bigger horizon that you see in a psychedelic experience, or that can only be found in a very deep identification with otherness, that then transforms motivation. And to me, that transformation of motivation must be at the very foundation of our thinking about new systems, new politics, new economics, new communities. Whereas what you get from, say, the news, or in my impression, is everyone needs to learn the truth. And, the truth, more education, more intelligence. But of course, that's always captured by power, because they define what constitutes the right worldview, right? So, but motivation is very decentralized. Intrinsic motivation is very, very decentralized, because it is your own unfolding as a unique node in these intersecting streams and influence and processes that are going, like that Whitehead dewdrop I mentioned at the beginning. And then that unique node, which is a decentralized, for me, motivation is how you get decentralized personality in a way. Whereas IQ kind of leads to a centralized personality, because the right personality is everyone who has the high IQ, right? And when personality, if you grant me that term here, I'd have to think about that. But when you don't make motivation central to your thinking, you can't have a decentralized personality. And if you can't have decentralized personality, then you can't have diversity. That's the irony, is you don't even get a true diversity, because everyone is just some IQ points in disguise, different skin colors, different religions, but ultimately all people are at their essence is IQ, right? Well, how dreadful. But if it was motivation, then it might be the aesthetic and artistic identity that is primary. Someone else, it might be the IQ. Someone else, it might be kinetic. Motivation makes space for a unity in that intrinsic motivation that is simultaneously open to diversity, that then also avoids centralization that makes it so easy to fall into socioeconomic capitalism, capture that then is a reversal of metaphysical entropy and entropy in general. And that seems to be so critical, because right now, when you have societies of awareness, basically, you need to be more aware of yourself. What is your IQ level? What is your career? Who are you? Well, awareness then turns in on the self and is the processes of entropy, right? Whereas if you have a socio-political system of self-forgetfulness, thanks to intrinsic motivation as being foundational, that reverses the energy flow per se, where you start moving away from entropy into necrophy, which if we don't do, then there seems to be a self-destructive mechanism that starts to that's been enacted and goes on. I think there's also, I like to talk about with Trey, communal ontology, where identity is fundamentally communal, which then sounds socialist, but it's actually a communal ontology found in that self-forgetfulness that then leads to an intrinsic motivational structure. So much of what you have said, I mean, I think it's magnificent.
Can we whiteboard? Am I allowed to whiteboard?
Of course you can whiteboard. We can share. Let me give you the share the screen thing. Can you do that? Yeah, you should be able to do that. Let me see. Okay,
Yeah,
you can. Great.
Okay, yeah. All right. All good symbols start with a circle. Let's do that. Okay.
Got it.
I think this is Jung's symbol of self. Yeah, so intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's a directionality to it that makes it more simple to see, like you're pointing out the paradoxical relationship between it. I think. Yeah, so when you're intrinsically motivated, your arrows actually pointed outward. So you're spontaneously generating what is, I'm going to define as order, right? So the ability to decide, the ability to make choices towards some aim teleologically, right? And that's pointed outwards. Extrinsically motivated. So, all right, I have to bring some other things in. Since this exists, this is self, right? A boundary condition. We're drawing a circle because we're trying to generalize, but we're much more lumpy than this. But fundamentally, we're a boundary condition.
Sure.
Yeah. So if we think of extrinsic motivation as the maintenance of this system by drawing into itself material, right? That's the nature of that. It's consumption.
Right.
This is what perpetuates this material. Material is other. It's outside. It's on the outside. It's exterior. That's where material comes from. We do not generate material. What we generate is order.
Right.
That's what we generate, and that is a gift given outwards. Right. So you have material and you have order. You have things which act and things which are acted upon. Those seem to be the foundational elements of, well, just to have, and then there's that which chooses, right? It's something like that which guides the actions, which are already acting, which are in a sense these collective motions. Now, for the sense of self thing, if you try to, so like here's this self. I'm going to put the mirror here, right? Here's a duplicate of self. If I try to model all of myself inside myself, that's a lot of real estate.
Sure.
Right? And the more like loby I am, the more strange and interesting and complicated, the more I try to model that in here, the more real estate is going to take up. Right? But because it's self-recursive, right? Like this thing in here is also doing this thing. And this thing and this thing, and it just dives down, and we're turtles, right? This is the problem that you're pointing to. If you focus on just modeling self, paying attention to self and what self can do, and as the inward turning, then you get stuck in this infinite recursion of modeling more and more of self, caring more and more only about self. So to do that, you just stop. to avoid that, you just stop doing it. You turn outwards, and you allow for the sense of self. Right? Because for whatever reason, we do have the need to be seen. This is real and true. And I don't think it may be primal, right? It may be basic to reality that we need to be seen. So this is distributed, right? The sense of identity and self is then distributed outwards.
Mm.
And that the carrying capacity outwards, right, is literally infinite.
Right.
So our sense of self as carried by the total system is infinite as compared to finite.
Mm.
That's the pure distinction between allowing for the other to carry us forward, right, versus the continual reclaiming, continually re-territorializing like our claim on things and drawing it into self.
Mm.
Right, it's kind of a chaotic image, and I don't know how helpful that was,
I
but
thought it was magnificent.
yeah. So this is this. I think your point is so wonderful because right now we're in an epidemic of influence on
Yes.
each other, and that influence is something like focusing on how you look
Yeah.
to other, so much so, right, that you have this exquisitely interesting but very harmful feedback loop between these like isolated schema for demanding attention, um, which allows you to wind up at some very crazy, interesting places. And here I will invoke everything that has happened lately with Yay.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
No,
Do you want to
I
draw? Do you want to draw on this, or do
I
I
can
close
draw a
it?
smiley face.
Yeah.
I've never used the whiteboard. That's pretty cool. Right there. So I have a smiley face there in different things. No, I think what you depicted there was magnificent.
Oh, wait. Let me break in again. Okay, I'm gonna cut
Yes,
you off. Okay.
please, please.
All right. So I'm gonna throw this in here because this is partly what I'm working on. So what I'm working on is a digital platform that will allow for us to instantiate this process.
Hmm.
So rather than communities focusing on becoming echolocations or echo chambers, excuse me, where they're perpetually establishing an order within, which winds up being fighting over words and terminology, which is
Sure.
that's what it always becomes. You connect them in a network, and you make it explicit that within this network, the aim is not to turn inwards to define yourself, but to project outwards the activities of the self
Right.
for the aim of the network, right? And I've got some really interesting ways I think that's possible with regards to the nature of using machine learning to gather and collate the total activities of a creative space to produce art, which is like a kind of phantasmagoric narrative, a self-expressiveness of the communal space. And then you can digest that as art and then share it with each other. And you get a kind of dreamlike experience of the ongoing activities of the people in that space. Right. I think it's a beautiful idea, and I'm just getting ready to open it up and invite people in and have them participate. This is just one aspect of it. I'm not really sure what to call this process yet. I'm tentatively calling it the loom, which is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, okay. So
Well, I want to do that program. So
of
that's
course, yeah, of course you would.
I am wow.
So
I'm
and this would incorporate images and text, by the way. So
absolutely
and the transformation of text into images, which is precisely what Dolly and GPT-3 and others are able to do. So
all right. Well, a few things. Uh, I think you are 100% correct that the communities eventually, when they're self-relating, is self-relating is the term. It becomes a fight over language. And do you know the language? Do you use the right terms? You actually see this emulated in just social interactions. Did you in your list of your values say freedom first or equality first? Because now you're a conservative. Oh, you're a liberal. Like people literally flag one another based on how they speak to determine who's in and who's out. Even if you literally say, I think Democrats and Republicans are both important for America. You said Democrats first. That means you think Democrats are more important. Like we're always looking for these things. And inevitably, communities devolve into that. Um, the second thing I wanted to say, and I just wanted to bring attention to it because I'll relate it to what you just said on the art. I strongly believe that people are basically doomed or in huge trouble without some kind of alterology is a term I've been using. So an alternative sense of being, like you mentioned, the psychedelic vision, people will talk about mystical visions, people will talk about artistic experience. There's something about certain experiences that people have that transform their entire horizon of how they carry themselves in the world. And without that, it's like death. Like if you never have that experience, it has some insanely profound impact on how you unfold. So alterology, how the alternative way you unfold, a sense that there's an alternative way of being as opposed to how you naturally carry yourself in the world. Categories can be like psychedelics, theology. I've even mentioned like some people have notions of transhumanism as being a kind of alterology, right? So there are these alterologies. So the problem is, without an alterology or a sense of an alterology, you have no sense of the fungibility of your boundary. You experience the world as a self-relating system. You have no sense that that boundary is fungible unless you have some sort of experience, not just idea, experience of the alterology. It's one thing to believe in God, something else to experience God. It's one thing to believe in alternative dimensions. It's entirely something else to experience alternative dimensions, right? And Layman Pascal, he'll talk about, and I've actually I really like it. He'll talk about the metaphysics of adjacency and the need for, he's like 99% is the new 100%, because that offness, that little missing of 1% allows fungibility in your model that is necessary to make space for the other and to not have your boundaries be too rigid. I was really taken by reading about his metaphysics of adjacency. He recently had a talk with Dr. Cadell Last, which I won't get into it. I do actually think you can associate with Hegel. Of course I do. And Ebert and different things like that. But the main point is, without a sense of an alterology, an experience of an alterology, it is very, very, very difficult not to fall into entropy, external motivation, and all the problems that we've outlined. One of the reasons why I'm very obsessed with art and aesthetic experiences is precisely because aesthetic experience seems to be something akin to an effort to spread alterological experiences. You can't necessarily have, if you've had, say, a mystic experience of the beatific vision in the Trinity, you can't just give that experience to someone else, but you may be able to construct a cathedral. You might be able to do St. Matthew's Passion that somehow simulates it on scale for other people, right? It's not perfect, but it may at least open people up to going, maybe these boundaries are a little more fungible than I want, which then may change how they carry themselves in the world until they have their own experience, right? So, we've talked a lot at the net about this problem of scale and spread, right? It seems to be so huge. And the issue of art is fascinating to me, where we'll always say like the fate of beauty is the fate of us, because there's something about art that has the ability to communicate high levels of information that are not merely linguistical or linear, right? There's something about art that is closer to an experience of a mystical vision than me telling you about a mystical vision, right? But you see, what's interesting is the notion, what you're pointing out that is friggin' magnificent, is that every community potentially has the material for something akin to a mystical vision if it only had the ability to bring forth and consolidate the information into a form that people could experience, which we've not really had until, say, potentially this AI technology, right? So the idea of, in a sense, visually representing the, dare I say, soul or spirit or deeper essence of a community beyond just a fight over the language, but into an experience. Because here's the thing, if it's language, it's going to go to self-relating negativity, because language tends to lead in the direction of reductionism, right? But if you can bind a community by experience, of which no one person has control over, because it's decentralized to the total interaction of everyone in that community that is then brought together by the AI technology, well, now the community's heart is depicted to the community in a decentralized form that is akin to an experience of something that feels alterological, because it is a result of a fungible boundary, because the individuals themselves cannot make that thing. And so it brings forth a vision of the I equals other that we're talking about that can be fully experienced and transformative in that experience. So yeah, what you're talking about blows my mind. I'm really glad you're making that.
Well, there's so much more, but I'm glad you're interested. Yeah,
Yes.
I'd hope to have you there. And Yeah, I try to get a word away from the word scalability because
Sure.
it's been utilized in the tech space to
Sure,
indicate
sure, 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 sure.
a singular platform that centralizes, in fact,
Sure,
right? So they
sure,
span
sure.
the globe.
Yeah, I've
So
been
the
moving towards spread. I know I use scale just because in economics we talk about the problem of scale and the game being different. But
hey,
I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're
I'm
saying.
just pointing out how I've moved away from it.
Sure,
You
sure,
can use it
sure.
however you want. Yeah. And I tend to focus more on replicability,
Mm.
right? And the
Ah,
replication in the sense that the answer to this is really truly, I mean, when you have children, there is no more potent sense of the othering of self, right?
sure.
It is the
Ah,
easiest manner by which one can recognize self and other. There's nothing else that we know of that can do that to
sure.
that power. And well, maybe we'll come closer, I think, to experiencing that with these collective visions of self, right? So the that recreation, like that dewdrop, holographically, in a projected sense, collectively, all of our dreams and visions. And so, in that replication sense, just projecting that up to the next layer in the sociological layer, what we're talking about is not it's not domination. It's not the imperial need to spread and cover and take all into one, but the recognition that when a thing has been deemed good and wishes to become more, instead of spreading like a cancer, it replicates
Mm.
and allows a new other to continually participate in the reformulation of that which was good within that thing that desired to become more. And so what you want to try to define is a set of communities that are exhibiting this behavior. And so the way that I've got this kind of protocol established is that you first you search for the approximate um, capacities that a community needs to function as a community in perpetuity. That's a quite difficult thing to define, and it's in fact site specific, depending on what you're doing. Nevertheless, it is something that it can be enumerated, right? It can be pointed out and discussed and sought after, and then in the needs of the organism, you begin to define the internal structures of it, right? And the pieces that it needs to survive. Those will be occupied by people that wish to persist in those patterns of behavior. Are you familiar with Christopher Alexander's work?
Yes, 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 yes.
So this idea is that rather than proscribe a structure, right, a set of buttons, a set of groups, a set of functions, events, and things that people must attend in order to generate community, that instead we ask them what patterns and we allow them to engage in what patterns they will on their own. And then we collect that together in conversation and in co-creation of that space, the patterns they wish to persist in that fundamentally are generating value both within the space and outside of the space,
Mm.
right? And that will converge and diverge continuously in an inhalation and exhalation in communication with the total network. So once you have one established community, which is representative of a kind of wholesomeness, what you do, like a cell, is you recruit a shadow element of each of those pieces, in a sense, right? So you let's say let's squash the size. I'm talking Dunbar numbers, which are facilitated by the addition of technology, so it might be considerably beyond the traditional Dunbar number. But let's squash it just for now. So let's say I have a group of 6, which functions in a good way, right? So they're perpetuating and growing together. Rather than grow that to 12 and really screw that up, right? The idea is each individual in the network grabs another person and they shadow that person in the group and just observe how it functions,
Mm.
right? And if the person resonates with any given function in the space, then they stay. If they don't, they hop back out onto a highway, which is connected to different other networks, which will allow them to eventually settle into a space where they resonate.
Mm.
And by doing this, I think with enough people, eventually, like a kind of like a roulette
Sure.
table, the ball will settle into a spot, and there will be a conjoined set of relationships which are producing things. And so this is how you replicate it. So once you have those established shadows, that then becomes the new group, right?
Mm.
Those elements change and shift. You can also do interesting things where rather than have the shadows comprise a new group, and the old group, you randomly assign or select either the new guard or the old guard to form the new group. Right, so you get this weird intermixing, because that's actually how chromosomes select genes. It seems there's kind of a seemingly random selection between these different things, and then they're pulled apart, and then you get a separated structure, which is well, incredibly precisely the same as that which it was before, and yet also just a little bit different. And that just a little bit difference is sufficient for it to continue and to persist within the whole organism. And well, yeah, so that's the aim, in a sense, that we begin to explore together in conversation from a lot of different perspectives what is completely necessary, not just an individual, let's use more of a Vakian language, ecology of practices, but communal, collective practices. And those aspects of what it would be like, I think, in this space are going to be primarily conversational with regards to the nature of understanding the languages that are being used worldwide. And that from that space, what we can derive in terms of value is the proper coupling of intelligence and memory, right? Such that we can together explore the space of what could be, and that will continuously invite whoever wants to participate in a structure like that, right? Not in the hopes of developing some utopic vision of a particular way of being, but in an ongoing co-creation sense. I think maybe, just maybe, we can produce something which either prevents the total catastrophic collapse of a world which is able to produce bombs and strains and mind control devices and protocols of various kinds to the extent that we can all end ourselves, or if that does collapse, the remnants, right, the thing which was built in the meantime while it was collapsing, is actually able to survive whatever does happen. That's the question. Now, there's different variations on this. Like Elon wants to go to Mars, and I was involved with Eric Weinstein's creation of his Discord portal, and well, Eric's an interesting guy. His explicit, stated plan was to create a teleportation device using some kind of hyperdimensional physics that we haven't yet discovered, or perhaps has already been discovered by aliens and it's been sitting in some hangar in Nevada, and we just need to recreate it ourselves. Yeah, so I'm actually with Camp Earth, let's call it Camp Home. And I think we, at the very least, can extend our search time and space for how it is we might actually properly relate to each other if we do make that our aim, rather than this compulsory participation in the development of technological solutions which will guarantee a kind of solution according to a particular vision. I've been studying a lot lately is various threads of influence in modern culture, right? The really interesting ways in which small groups have attempted to exert influence on the total space. All the conspiratorial stuff is in there too, right? Like the nature of the connections behind places, the nature of the way in which intelligence agencies infiltrate and influence spaces. Yeah. This is also something I've been observing up front and up close. And that subtlety it's a very interesting question about the nature of destabilizing systems, how it is we destabilize systems. Where did I was reading something earlier, and someone had written in a book, some random book, fantasies can become reality when they have existed for long enough within the sociological space, and they kind of define that by a couple of different things. So there's really something interesting about the way in which fiction precedes technological advancement.
Yes.
Say it
Yes.
that way. A vision of what's possible is put into our minds, a la Jules Verne, and that's actually how I index it in my mind, as a kind of Vernian index. But the manner in which books are written and disseminated that hint to us the way in which we could conceive of our futures. And I would submit that for much of the history of the human race, a large number of the people that we would traditionally say are high IQ, right? High intelligence, defined in that sense, in the ability to predict and to create structures, incredibly complex structures, which manifest those predictions. But this has been going on for a long time. The use of imagery and ecstasy and terror to produce a kind of practical outcome, which is divorced from the symbological meaning of that whole space. It's a shell game, right? And that was a point I was thinking about earlier when you're talking about beauty. The way in the proper relation in beauty is not consumptive.
Right.
Yeah, we are drawn towards it, but what happens when we get there? That's the question. Like, what happens when you get to the beautiful? Do you consume it, or do you, via love, like invite it to be more of what it is, right?
100%.
Rather than less of what it is. Which is interesting regarding the nature of why humans kiss. Let me say that. Yeah, it's like symbolically attempting to eat each other, but not doing it. You're saying, I could eat you, I could consume you, you thing that I deem beautiful and good, but I am not, right? In fact, what we're going to engage in is this mutual exchange, right? This continual back and forth, where the question of what we do together is always this, well, it's a dance of what space is not occupied, and having that space continually shift and then filling, and like that dance, both in kissing and in the wider ways in which we relate to each other, not just in that sense, but it is, that's it in a simple sense.
Well, that's fascinating. I had not thought about that. That's really an interesting biological metaphor there. Or that's fantastic. A few things. One, I really like the use of the word reproduction or reproduce as opposed to scale or spread, because I've been groping around looking for a term, and the notion of reproduce is so nice, because that is indeed, it's a question of can it be reproduced as opposed to can't, because scale almost inherently has a centralization sound to it, as a even spread, whereas reproduce is more of what you're trying to use. You're trying to see if the conditions can be reproduced, but yet be unique, right? As opposed to controlled. So reproduce is a really nice term. I appreciate that. I will definitely use that. I really like it. And I'll say, everyone go try Tyler's new program. And I really like what you were saying. The second thing is on Christopher Alexander. Yeah, my kids found the book where he talks about like the kid cubby and you need to make it in the corner. And like, Dad, why didn't you make this? And I'm like, I don't know. Y'all can get in the closet if you want. It's kind of similar. And I really like how you spoke about him in terms of what patterns do we want to dwell in. And, as an architect, like this question of what patterns do we want to dwell in? And it's interesting because without the technology that you're describing, it's almost like the only patterns we in these communities can dwell in are linguistical, right? Like those are kind of linguistical, but the problem is language is so tricky and terms are so tricky and it's hard to communicate. So it's not a very effective tool. Like you can almost think of language as an architectural tool, right? And imagery can be an architectural tool, right? And so but the problem is, too, if one person makes a painting or draws a painting and says, this is what the net is about, well, then it's centralized, the one person's idea of what it is, and they drew it, and then it can feel more kind of top down, right? But if it was possible to generate an image that was emergent, if you grant me that language, emergent out of the community, then what's so interesting about that is it's a blending between the individual and the community, like the community, the collective. It would not be possible without individuals. So you can't say that individuals don't matter, but you also can't say that the image is reducible to say individuals, right? And what we've tried to do is basically do that with language. I guess you could even take religions start usually with holy books, not all of them, or some sort of teaching, right? So there's some sort of linguistical architecture that everyone's trying to share. But the problem is since linguistical architecture is so prone to forgetting, misinterpreting, and so on, it has to be people have to be very rigid, and they almost become police officers eventually about one another, right? To make sure that you're using Trinity correctly, or homeostatic, or game B, and you're using these terms correctly, and you get a police structure that becomes very problematic. And the moment you have a police structure, it can feel actually individual and like it's no longer ours, because you're like, well, I use spirit different than as you use it. And are we really going to make, binding to this community definition dependent, right? And that's when you get the fracturing, because it always becomes about language, right? Yeah. And so far, we really haven't even had a technology for an emergent language, right? Or anything like that. I guess now if you're GPT or whatever it's called, that could be possible. But even that, the problem is, even if you succeeded that, it's not the mystic experience. We were saying earlier that it's an experience of an alterology that changes people, not a verbal communication or description of that alterology, right? But if you have an emergent image of the sort of transcendent, the emergent soul or essence of the community that is not reducible, but it also speaks to something that has been co-created, then it has almost that function of the kiss, right? Like, this is what we've done together, but we can't consume one another. And that very back and forth, that kind of speaks to what you drew on the whiteboard, is then represented in the very imagery, in the very art, in the very beauty that then comes out. And that becomes then a way to speak to that becomes the patterns that we dwell among, right? That becomes the patterns that we dwell among, that is simultaneously, in the Alexander sense, that you're simultaneously creating in a manner that is not reducible to any individuals. And then that would, of course, dramatically increase the effectiveness of determining what community you want to be part in versus not, in the way you were describing the roulette board, because right now you have to go into a community, learn the lingo, learn the language, and that takes a long time, right? We were talking about moving the bookshelf in a matter of pace, right? So right now, one of the problems is kind of pace, where people enter a community and it's very difficult to enter its cathedral per se, because the cathedral is linguistical based, where if it was image based, it would be much quicker to sort of enter into the cathedral, right? And to have the experience or not, right? Well, the reason why pace for determining your citizenship in a community is a big deal is because if it takes a long time, you see this happening in dating, right? Like, people will date someone and they don't want to waste. It's like, I've been doing this for 6 months and I don't want it to be a race. So you start a waste of time. So you start rationalizing, right? You start kind of rationalizing your involvement, and that's where it can be ineffective in different things. But if you could increase the pace by which people could determine if this is the vision I want to live and if this is the vision you want to live according to, or these the patterns I want to dwell within, that would greatly increase the probability of the effectiveness of people joining the right networks at the right time. And then as people join the right networks at the right nodes in network, I guess, that they're supposed to, the right patterns, then the patterns that are generated by that node would get all the better. And you would have the acceleration, right? So that what you are describing as a creation of a image architect, if you grab me, aesthetic kind of architect, that is emergent and not reducible to the individuals, strikes me as having an incredibly powerful practical function that is dealing with how to create communities that are engaged in activities of creation as opposed to entropy, of necrophy as opposed to entropy. So what you're talking about is fantastic, Tyler.
Yeah, and it's an attempt to avoid this this problem that we keep confronting. So we identify with other by recognizing self and other, right? Like, that's what we're doing.
Yes.
And so this naturally happens when we meet another, which is like us. It's another human, right?
That's
And
right.
so we fall in love with very charismatic people that tell us that they know how to control everything.
Right.
Take advantage of being able to answer our questions that we can't answer for ourselves,
That's
or
right.
feel that we can't answer for ourselves, because that's the way the world seems to be.
Yes.
And my sense is we just don't have to do that, that we can take the product of individuals and bring it together in a collective vision, and that will help alleviate this tendency that we have to require a single attractor, a charismatic attractor, to define a space, and that will help alleviate some of the uh, additional problems which crop up from too much attention being focalized in, in one spot, too focal attention. And what that leads, or what that leaves, is it allows the attention to be, well, more diffuse within the space, and to generate more than just the narrow needs of the individual that calls that forward. So, I mean, I can go on Twitch or YouTube and I can find any number of communities defined by a personality. Right. And some of them are extraordinary in the sense that they represent a good exchange of feelings, like positive feelings and emotions with each other. But it's a very narrow existence that only exists on top of the entirety of the rest of modernity. Right. The electrical grid, petroleum products, affordable housing, governments that aren't trying to kill you, whether or not war is happening in your backyard, all of that stuff, which is being ignored in a sense because the spectacle of what we're participating in is it's only autocatalytic. So it's just generating only itself rather than its relation to the wider network. And so we need to be able to coexist together and mutually afford each other to our best selves, which means we need more of our attention split between helping each other do that, right? That outward expression of taking what capacities I have to lift you up, you taking what capacities you have to lift me up, and we're all doing that at once, and that creates synergy, right? That creates synergy. That creates that which could never have been predicted between two interactions. And in a sense, maybe you're aware of Forrest's work. He points this out explicitly, I think. Well, he does. The relationship between objects is more basic than the objects themselves, right? Because the object, the interior cannot predict, it doesn't have access to that which will happen when it comes in contact with another thing. It's just not within it. If it were within it, it would it would already know, but it doesn't. And so when those things come in contact, what happens when they come in contact is known by neither of them, and yet it is consistent. So that capacity for relationality is more basic than the identity. And that needs to be, I think, more of an understanding, like a pure understanding between us, rather than the egoically defined kind of closed boundary condition of self. And I think that will allow for like a greater flow and exchange of energy in a more beautiful manner too. Like the kinds of art that I can see taking place when you allow multiple communities to engage in this collective conversation, right? Yeah, that's because I can see it. It's already in a sense happening at different layers, but the ability for the ability for it to be a more focused approach for a particular set of people that can then engage with the actuality of the wider world, right? Like, so this is, oh, let me draw again. This will help real quick.
Take your time.
All right, so let's call. So this is the surface of the Earth. And these are lines of connection. This is, all right, okay, so let's call this, my project is called, and I named this before Facebook, called Metagora. All right, came to me in my psychedelic vision. So I don't care what it's called. I really don't. But this was an attempt to establish an understanding of this collective attention reasserting itself into the marketplace to regain some justification for how its existence. And that includes different components. me draw a box here for that. It's a filter box of some kind. Another one. So this right here is a factory for taking the present state of individuals in the world, bringing them together in conversation, and then outputting some, it's a function which outputs something, right? Now, what that something is different based on like different aspects of what develops within the community. My own personal interest and the interest of many others is that the output of these kinds of activities goes back here, right? It doesn't stay up here in like abstract land and possibility, but it goes back here to the surface of the earth and actually constructs new ways of being, right? Like sustainable communities that don't require a globalized, centralized means of production for all the basic components that we need. So food, fuel, information. Let's say it like that, right? Energy and information. Those things need to be co-created in an ongoing aspect of what it is to participate. And like I said before, I think it can't be limited to just putting paper in a ballot box or more increasingly clicking a digital button. Okay, so not everyone is going to want to participate in that, right? So you have other factories where people go in and their output is something else. But in general, the idea, and this is another way to think of this, is something like this is bone marrow over here. You know, bone marrow is where like pluripotent or where stem cells are produced, right? And then what happens is they kind of bump around the body until they find a spot where they settle into, and then they grow into a cell lineage, right? They define themselves, a pattern of being. And so there's an idea that when how it is you arrive at a community is this functional thing, right? It's like what attracts me and what do I do when I get there? So a part of what is needed for these things is an onboarding process that is what we call education. Tim has a triplicate, which is really interesting here that we've talked about a lot.
Yes.
Education, contribution, and belonging. So education can also be thought of as like invitation, which is like, if you learn this, you can be a part of this, right? And this is what allows you to engage at the very minimum with the space. Contribution is what you do when you get there. So now that you're in, once you've crossed over the boundary condition of a space, what do you do when you get there? And is the product of your output accepted by that which is already there? That's that sense of belonging. And if you have all of that, what you develop is an organism which wishes to persist, right? Like if everyone involved has that aspect of it, where they're continually educating and inviting, and then producing, like actually producing something, and then having a feeling of belonging because that production is of value, right? Then you have something. So I think the best value that we can create regarding the total state of the system of the world right now are these functional, independent, self-sustaining communities in network with each other that allow for free association, for freedom of travel, freedom of association, freedom of speech, all that freedom that we need in order to self-select where it is we can, where we can find a kind of harmony. And that harmony is that is the metaphor that I see. It is musical. It's a musical one. Because when you have multiple voices, you can either sing one pure note, which isn't that interesting, right? Or you can sing a chord, right? You can sing a chord of notes, and that's many voices singing at once, but still in harmony. So trying to figure out what these chords are, like what it is that we kind of need to sing together, that's the aim, the general aim of the project. And the tools are structured in such a way as to facilitate pointing ourselves towards that, right? And continually inviting and addressing that issue, rather than addressing the issue of how do you get the best market product to the best consumer, because that's just a crazy way to direct attention. But that's the way we've been doing it for a long time. So.
Well, Tyler, magnificent. A few that's magnificent. A few things. One, I really like how you're positioning this work in contrast to the charismatic leader, because indeed that seems to be kind of the prime characteristic of a lot of these communities. Oh, we are followers of X, Y, and Z. And that's not inherently bad, but it's, of course, can be, and it has a tendency to be corrosive or very contingent. And it tends to be very fragile because if that person under that pressure is corrupted, it tends to have it discourages in a very bad way. It leads to nihilism, hopelessness, and so on and so forth. And of course, it also it can be strongmen, right, in very problematic ways. So I really like how you.
Issue again.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
a issue because if the size of the people attendant to a single individual, if their choices can't be met by that individual, so if that individual can't respond to the total needs of the space, then it fractures and subdivides. Then it becomes rebellious, right? Then it becomes a satellite, which then goes back and attacks. Okay, sorry.
No, that's magnificent. And I also just wanted to note, I really like how you're situating so much of the issue as a matter of pace and processing as opposed to can and cannot. Because usually it is processing. And what people get upset about is processing speed or pace or amount of time. Theoretically, over 1,000,000 years, the guy could get around to addressing everything that the organization needed. He's just not able to do it in a manner that is satisfying. So I think framing it that way also helps show why using this AI technology to address the pacing issue in some areas is in fact an extremely important solution, because it's not so much because it's not that the structure of the communities that already exist is inherently wrong, it's that it is perhaps not quick enough, right? Or in order to deal with its slowness of pace, then it turns to a charismatic leader, right? Like and that's kind of to deal with a pacing issue. So if it's a pacing issue, then it is not a problem with the essential structure of communities or evidence that humans should be all like individuals out in the woods or something, right? Because that could be the temptation, and we've seen that historically, right? Where communities break down, then people are like, well, screw it, I'm just going to go off in the wilderness, right? Well, no, the issue has been pacing a lot of the time. There has not been the technology to deal with problems of pacing that has then led to solutions, quote unquote, to deal with those problems that have actually had unintentional consequences. The other thing I want to say is that governments tend to know that psychotechnology is one of the most important technologies. And, if you don't have control over your quote unquote psychological development as a people, you don't have control. Like there's a real sense in which psychological control is control. And governments tend to be very good at that. That's why the FBI, the CIA, all of these organizations have done so much work in that. And one of the problems right now is basically technology is giving us our psychology, right? And like we're being pulled ahead by technology because we don't know how to produce ways of thinking that are not captured by technology, alluding to Heidegger and Deleuze and different things. And it's very difficult to know how to do that. Well, a way you do that is by being intentional about your, what I like to call non-rationality, your truth that organizes your rationality, right? And you can say, well, I'm not going to have my truth be, say, global capitalism. I'm going to have my truth be, say, Christianity or something, right? So that becomes your non-rationality that organizes your rationality, and that's how you can avoid capture. The problem, though, of course, is that can be individual. That's relative to your interpretation of Christianity, and it may not have the robust resources needed to entirely avoid the consequences on a global scale of technology, right? Because maybe you in your personal life may find an individual map that helps you resist the cell phone, but that may not as a global order be enough, right? And that's where you get, the problem of, now I want to call reproduction. I've been calling it the problem of spread, or scale, but that's, that's a mistake I see all the time where people think an individual solution is a general solution. Well, that's not the case. That's entirely different matters. So the thing is, too, what you're pointing at is a way for a community to emergently generate a aesthetic representation of the non-rational foundation of that community that cannot be reduced to an individual member of that community that can then organize the rationality in a manner that is alternative to the techno-rational capture that tends to define general capitalism today. And to then make that non-rational principle, foundation, something that is communicated quickly and readily to people in the form of an experience, as opposed to linguistical information, therefore radically increases the effectiveness and the movingness on a full body level of that community to people so that they can determine if they want to be part of that or not. And if you increase the effectiveness of that sorting mechanism, then the beauty of the harmony that is generated, that then becomes a feedback loop that, you know, accelerates against entropy rapidly, increases radically the effectiveness of that system, of which we really, really need to find an effective system to do that, precisely because of the power of this technology, the way it captures our rationality, and then so on and so forth, or the meta crisis, as is talked. So generally, yeah, Tyler, that's pretty freaking grand. And I really like what you're saying, because this is such a radical problem in thinking, you know, in thinking the way you're thinking about it from all these different angles and bringing it together. You are is really magnificent, because it's bringing it. You know, I sometimes resist the practical language, you know, because it's like, oh, we need to be practical, which could be problematic if it's moralizing practice over thought. But there is something to be said about thinking about stuff to be concrete, right? To bring it into the practical. And the fact that you've thought about this so well, I'm just very impressed. And yeah, I mean, the way it's like you're using AI to generate an aesthetic experience of an alterology for a communal ontology that combats entropy. Because a lot of what you're describing, I like to call communal ontology as opposed to individual ontology, where you're defining I equals other, and you're using AI to emerge out of a community an aesthetic experience of the alterology that defines that communal ontology, so that it can better and more effectively combat entropy for itself, for others, and to be more effectively invitational to other people that want to join it. I just think that's magnificent, Tyler. So well done to you, sir.
Thank you. I don't know to what degree each of the elements I discuss have any. I've tried to speak very generally today in this context with who I think may be watching, or what interest they may find in it. There's a lot more specifics, and a lot of it's built already. The website itself is running, and
very nice.
There are lots of aspects which have yet that will need enormous teams of people to build. Right? I can't do it. And I've had a little help along the way. And to call again back to the community of individuals that are in fact watching this, or adjacent somehow, there are many people that see aspects of this, right? They see, and I've spoken with many of them, and they all have a kind of a kaleidoscopic, fragmentary vision of these needs, of ways in which we can relate to each other in this modern era that will meet our needs. The needs are existential needs. So to avoid crisis, and to, well, partly to be able to transform suffering into joy, let's say, something like that, but to do that voluntarily by moving towards suffering. And that seems to be one of the harder things for us to do, which is why the machine that chews us up and spits us out functions by promising that it will take away all of our work, all of our suffering, right? And answering those things for us. And I would say partly what, and just to call back to this initial problem that we keep running into, is this differentiation and capacity to see and feel like one knows how the world should be. And so when we arrive at a group of people at the top who feel they are quite capable, right, that they see a great deal, and then they attempt to exert that influence on the world, partly the reason that they're doing that, I think, if I'm charitable, right, because there are evil people in the world. Let me state that clearly. There are people that have gotten to such a point that my recognition of them is that they are wholly opposed to life, right? Which is that destructive force which has to exist. In a sense, it's like a vacuum which, through its exploitation of weakness, collects all of the failings of the system and ultimately undermines it. And so the pieces that we're left with or the primordial matter of our eternal attempt to return again. So I think partly is to be charitable, partly what's occurring is people at the top say, and I can find this in innumerable references, oh, those in particular founding fathers, right? You wouldn't want the masses to act. We don't really want democracy. You wouldn't want the masses to actually say what they want because they're all fools.
Right.
So they have a sense that they couldn't explain to the masses properly. They couldn't understand how it is they need to be.
Right.
Why is that? Why is that? My sense is that there is an enormous gulf between communication. There's a deficit of feedback between the top and the bottom. So the middle is missing. That middle, whatever size it has to be with regards to the network of communication, it's probably dynamic in different circumstances, is what translates the value-oriented structures, the propositions, and the perspectives from top to bottom. Right? That's its function. That's what it should do anyways. So in a sense, in a strange sense, like the middle class is like this buffer between the poor and the rich.
Oh, sure.
Which acts as a kind of translational mechanism of values between the two. And I think what we need is to develop a communicational layer that produces a gradient of translational capacity such that there is no enormous gulf, no gap between one world and another, so enormous that there can't be some chain of conversations between the two, right? And if I trust you and you trust your neighbor and they trust their neighbor and the 6 degrees of bacon up to the top, right? Then we're trusting the reliability of that network. And that's in fact precisely how our neurons function. Right? That's precisely how all this stuff functions with regards to the transmission of information. So I think you can actually establish a pattern of dissemination of concentrated thought at the top, let's call it, so the expert domain, via a relatively regulated process of group discussion and group feedback that elicits not just propositional statements, but emotive content as well.
Right.
So both the value proposition, the values and the propositions. And I think I've got some interesting novel ways to do that using different kind of emotive mappings and all, and real-time feedback and protocol between a kind of well, informally, let's see, like informally, the IDW, right, was this kind of cloistered discussion group, most of which was occurring outside of what people were perceiving. It wasn't even really a thing, but it was a conversational space taking place. And in a sense, that's always happening. Peers are coming together to form a peerage. And in that space, they attempt to decide what and how they might work together to inform themselves upon the world.
Right.
Yeah. And their efforts to do that might fail utterly. And I'll point directly to something like Jordan Hall and Jim Rutt's attempts from very early on to establish a kind of game be political movement. That the difference between the ability to enunciate one's aims and desires and the ability for that to be interpreted or heard properly is sometimes enormous.
Right.
And sometimes the people at the top have no idea what their statements are actually having with regards to impact on those at the bottom. And so that necessity for the ability to produce functional translation between those disparate domains is what we need. And that's what's being created right now in this space spontaneously, that people are developing this capacity to gather together and then sift through and appreciate this. So we just need to make that a little more concentrated and establish it as a means by which that can then plug into the rest of practicality. Okay, because even if you don't feel like you have to participate in practical aspects of it, the sensibility that you have within yourself, if anything at all, to say to the world, no, it should be done this way, then you should have the ability to say that to someone that has the capacity to do, right? And then they have to be able to tell you in feedback, whether or not that actually functioned and did anything. So
everything you just said is so critical. I've always had a soft spot for Habermas's communicative rationality, where what he argues is that basically democracy has no chance unless its rationality is based on the communicative act, conversation, talking with one another. And basically for him, that means the death of debate is the death of everything. Because the Enlightenment project, now he's going to be much more in favor of the Enlightenment project. And of course, it depends on what you mean by that. No one is anti rationality. The problem is autonomous rationality, as I call it, where rationality tries to be its own grounding. And we'll talk about that in the conflict of mind, the truism of the rational, where rationality is in denial of its need for experience to organize its activities, in denial of its relational aspects, so on and so forth. But if we're talking about rationality as situated within, say, a communal ontology, if you grant me that language, or something more Whiteheadian or whatever, that's perfectly fine. But anyway, Habermas, in communicative rationality is like, hey, if we lose the ability to communicate and to share information, then democracy has no chance and the Enlightenment project is over. Well, here's the problem. Communication's really hard. Words are really tricky. And everyone in their community, it's very, very, very difficult to underappreciate how much your relationships are embedded in a particular language game. You get so used to that language game and your terminology that it's like the fish swimming in water. They don't know they're in water. It's like, what the heck is water when the old fish comes around? David Foster Wallace talks about that. Literally, everyone's language games are like that. Wittgenstein famously said that there's no such thing as a private language. That's true, but there are private communicative languages. It's almost like gated communities or whatever. It's like there's lots of gated communities of language, right? And everyone basically eventually falls into some sort of quote unquote gated community of language. It's most obvious between English and Chinese and German. That's obvious, but actually it applies within English to English in different areas, different reading. Like if I can say, Candy Compson to someone and they know what I'm talking about, well, they're in the language game of reading Faulkner, right? I mean, we really, truly underappreciate how gated we are in our language game. So though Habermas, and this is why I've always gone back on, like, though Habermas, I think, is convincing in where he says the quality of democracy is contingent upon its information flows, basically, we're screwed then because basically conversation, and obviously with the computer, information is so easily captured and so on and so forth that you just simply can't do it. But fortunately, here's the thing. Art communicates. Experience communicates. Being present communicates. If we take the whole Derridian deconstructionist project to be like, language always fails, words always defer, and all those different things. So therefore, speaking basically always fails. Well, that's true, but we also are always speaking, and also language doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be approximate. You don't have to know exactly what I mean by the word cat. You just kind of have to kind of know what I mean by the word cat to go from there. And you see, so the thing is, we don't need a precise language. We need an approximate language, right? But here's the thing, approximate language linguistically tends to create division. But if instead you had approximate language in terms of an aesthetic experience that you can understand because you're part of the community that generated that aesthetic experience and therefore resonate with it, then approximal language is more than enough to meet the needs of communication that Habermas emphasizes in communicative rationality to make democracy functional. And so see that to me, like you brought up Mr. Rutt and Mr. Hall, and yeah, there's a lot of groups that attempt political movements, but they don't, and I'm not bashing them. Everyone makes this mistake. Like there's an underappreciation of how high the fence is in your language community. Like the fence is so high. And also there usually is also an underappreciation of how difficult it is to get people, say, to do the piping for your bathroom, to do the Wi-Fi towers. Like, how are you going to convince people to go out in the cold and put up the electric wires when you lose power during the winter, right? Like the problem of motivation is so deep and profound that I basically always see that as overlooked. And that's also why making motivation foundational for your problem solving to me is like, that's kind of the big lesson of economics. Now, I'm not trying to reduce everything to economics, but economics is like, you really have to take seriously the problem of motivation and how motivation is experience based, not information based. So you have to create experiences for people to be motivated to do things that they may otherwise not do, or to stick it out when stuff is tough, right? Like if they don't have the glue of experience, then when there's the first disagreement in the community, they tend to fly off, right? They tend to go elsewhere. But if you have the glue of experience and also the understanding that difficulty is a necessary component of growth, that, to give in to the difficulty can actually be to invite self-relating negativity and entropy, well, then you can get a lot of trouble, right? So the main point, to me, what you're describing is a response is addressing the problem of commutative rationality that Habermas outlines, but not in a manner that under appreciates the difficulty of language games. And that is a big deal, because for me, that is like the creative act. I talk about Badrag. That's creativity. That is the unity of a beatific vision. That is a shared experience that tends to be the foundation of a community that is driven on intrinsic motivation. But the idea of representing this deeper emergent level as a communicative element, as a communicative product that can have this, is friggin' magnificent. So again, well done, sir.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to, let's say, throwing my hat into the ring explicitly. I've been bouncing around, peering under the skirts, let's say, of various organizations, trying to find their secret parts, to use an inappropriate metaphor. but it's, I think it's just, there's always something beyond the veil. I don't know. And I've always been drawn to wanting to know what is beyond, right? And there's great danger in that, because you tend to look beyond the mark, right? And so then what I return to is always this question of pacing. So what I've been playing around with in addition to this, and maybe this is kind of the worst point to land on if we're landing on anything, but is a way to not dispense with currency, but to make it more utilitarian in a sense. Rather than having a singular currency which functions as a, let's call it, well, it's kind of infinitely fungible, like pure value accounting system. You have different kinds of currency which relate to different paces, right, of value. And I think that's actually what's occurring in our brain. We have maybe Kahneman's work, right? Thinking fast and slow.
Sure.
Right? This notion that there are activities that we can engage in with a certain kind of risk and a certain kind of pace, but other things which relate to a deeper, longer kind of slow wave through culture need to be attended to with a very different kind of value. That's right. Intermixing those two is an extraordinary mistake that the young make.
That's right.
Right. And it's because they have to learn it through experience. And that is another primary motivation I think I have for engaging in this, is because I want a world that I can invite my children into.
That's right.
And there's so much of it right now that I can't bring myself to invite them into it. Not because it doesn't offer a challenge to them, it certainly is, but because I think the adventure of our day, the calling that we have, is like any of the others that have happened in different inflection points in the past. It's the continual renewal and recreation of like the purest things that we want to carry with us forward into the future, the things that will allow us to have a future. And for that to be justifiable in the present too, in concert with the past. So
I think that is magnificent. Richard Rorty was kind of once, the neo-pragmatist, and they were like, yeah, well, if God doesn't exist, because, he's an atheist, and like, what do you live for? And he's kind of like, well, you live for your great, 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 great grandchildren. And he's trying to kind of hook it up with children. Now, that's all well and good, but if you don't know how to make the world a better place for your children, or you have a centralized notion of the good that you then impose upon everyone, well, that may not be it, right? So there's this, and actually that is kind of, another thing is thinking in terms of children can actually be extremely motivating and turn life into an adventure, right? And so it has a very positive force. The question then becomes the way to go about it that actually is going to be needing, that is actually going to help them not end up in a self-relating negativity, right? That's going to actually help them situate themselves in a community. I think that this notion of currency, economy, I think that's very, very important. And it's interesting because I think we always have to remember, especially in a fiat currency, that there's something about the reliability of a currency that is pegged to the kind of experience you have in the country. And we kind of forget about this. Like when I say like the yuan, one of the reasons now the yuan is losing value is not merely because the government is, not reliable. It's also the kind of experiences that are unfolding within China that seem totalitarian. People are being, because of COVID and the protests and all that, right? Whereas when people talk about the dollar, yeah, they may think the government is crap. They don't think it's too good, but there's a sense of if you lived in America, the experience would not be so bad. It would be a little more stable, right, than other parts of the world. So there's some sort of intuitive sense that currency and economies in general are tied to kinds of experience, right? Now, one has to go into the details of that. But one of the problems we have right now on decentralizing community is it is very difficult to get a sense of the kind of experience that can be found in these decentralized communities, right? Beyond, say, just an exchange of linguistical information on a Discord or on a chat or whatever, right? That could be valuable, but it's also very linguistical. And it's very difficult to base an economy on linguistical experience. It needs to be more on a full body experience, right? I am extremely tempted. Yeah, well, it's like intrinsic research code with Anthony and obviously the Web 3.0 and different things like that. There are these efforts to figure out new pricing mechanisms. The way I've called it, as you know, I've spoken before, it's the problem of goods, services, and approaches, or horizons. I'm now leaning toward horizons because it's Wednesday and, I change what I like based on the day of the week. I'm joking. And there's this real problem, right? Well, one of the reasons it's so difficult to price horizons because it is not so clear the nature of the experience of that horizon beyond a mission statement. You go to the organization, you see the mission statement, so on and so forth. One of the reasons everything you've described to me is so freaking fascinating is because you are profoundly increasing the quality of the information of the kind of experience that can be found in these communities, which greatly increases the probability of accurately aligning a new currency system with those communities because the quality of the information goes through the roof, right? And so that has been a massive problem in figuring out how to accurately peg. They've tried it with the cryptocurrency, right? But it all feels like a really speculative market, right? Even if you have real currencies or ones that are trying to be part of a community, it still has a speculative feel to it because all information that is primarily linguistical is primarily interpretive. And interpretation emotionally strikes the human mind as speculative. Right? I'm just interpreting it, right? But if you replace that information with something more akin to an experiences, yes, they have to be interpreted, of course, but they actually kind of shut down interpretation. When you walk in and listen to Beethoven's Ninth, it is not primarily an interpretation. Afterwards, you may interpret what you think Beethoven's Ninth is about, but during it, the music's hitting you, the emotions are hitting you. It is primarily an experience. And then afterwards, you can engage in speculating, quote unquote, what Beethoven's Ninth was about. Here's the problem. Right now, a lot of the Web 3.0 stuff starts as an interpretation and then ends as an interpretation, right? So it feels interpretative the whole way down because it's primarily linguistical, right? But if you had something more where you started with something more like an experience and then you speculated the value of that experience, it feels more grounded. It feels like a gold standard, like an experience standard, almost like a gold standard, right? It has a stronger standard by which then to organize the potential economic activity relative to that experience. But right now, there is no quick way, no quick and effective way to generate a lot of that high quality information for people so they can be more mobile in the networks to determine where they should, quote unquote, invest their time or invest their individual personality and conditionality. By providing a way to increase the effectiveness of that information in terms of a fuller experience, that would go a long way to helping with the pricing problem of horizons, because it would have because you would know what the horizon was better. Never perfectly, because certainty is not possible, but the quality of the information that would be used to determine what the horizon is that you are pricing or attempting to price or attempting to determine the investment mechanism would be far greater, thus increasing effectiveness in the system. So I see what you're doing as very much tied to the economic problem, because for me, aesthetics, economics, those things all go together, and you're absolutely providing a way for a higher quality information within that schema of problems.
Well, I hope so. I don't think I'm providing it, but what I'm encouraging
Sure.
is that we explore that in participation with each other.
Yes.
And that in the exploration of that together, a problem which is insoluble by a single individual is collectively participatory solving, right? It's like it's something that we create together, and that we have an understanding that we're creating it together. Oh, I'll just draw something again.
Please.
I love drawing. Images are very helpful. See, I don't think in words.
A lot, but the full body, like nobody does. We just become so logocentric that we lose that.
Okay, so let's talk about horizons and pricing mechanisms. Okay, so here's a horizon. Here's a section of that horizon that I define value within. It has a quantity of volume, right? This is the gold standard, right? I can break off a chunk. It's $1. Right? I can assign value to this chunk. If I break all the chunks, whatever. Why is it $1 though? Why can't it be $100? Why can't it be $1,000?
Right.
Oh, look what's happening. This one piece, according to my sensibility of it, is now like increasing in value, but this isn't changing.
Right.
What's changing? What is changing? Well, what's changing is my belief about it. This is just belief. This is held within me. And so when we decoupled from the gold standard, we made it more explicit that all of our, use of currency is essentially a proxy for belief, which is why you're pointing to the relationship between the value of money and the experience in the country. It has to do with the reliability of the currency, the belief that we have that the dollar bill or the yen or the yuan is going to be stable enough such that when I have this piece, 3 months down the road, it's going to be worth like some, relatively stable amount. But that's not where we are now, right? That's not at all where we are now. What we've done is we've taken every chunk. This is all severed now. And so we're in a fully abstract domain where it's only the numbers, right? And so now it's just numbers flying around, making more numbers. And so I think a huge part of the problem that we can dispense with immediately if we can realize this. And maybe look, I know men love playing this game. In fact, an enormous amount of intellect and creativity and beauty goes into the financial sector. Men just love it. It's such a great game, and they get really good at playing. But it doesn't mean it's the only game, and that's not the only way we have to play it. You can arbitrage all day long, but fundamentally, I think when money becomes the object of itself, when money makes its own value, when it becomes the Ouroboros, right? When it's just eating itself, then you have all these you have this unpredictable chaos, because then the structure of this value is only tied to how much I can make you believe it's worth.
Right.
So then every bit of value is only based on my capacity to convince you of things.
That's correct.
Right? And then all I do is I develop more and more capacity to convince, and then that becomes decoupled from reality. And the farther it goes, the more catastrophic it becomes. And that's really what we've been going through, these cycles of boom and bust, because the money quantity and the evaluation of a particular market expands far beyond its actual capacity to hold that value for any amount of time. And so we're right back to pace. And so the idea is that we fraction our currency into evaluations of pacing. And the decisions that we make based on these signals in the marketplace have to recognize that. And that signal has to be, it has to, in some sense, it has to be non-fungible. There has to be some participatory process that produces the translation between those two currencies. It can't just be an arbitrary fungibility that you can just manifest influence by accumulating slow or fast in one or the other, and then essentially demolishing the other domain by an improper amount of influence. And that's exactly what people are arguing about in politics, whether or not the memory of my parents are too overbearing about what it is I want to do in my life. And that tension that we have between being beholden to the way things are versus the way things could be is what we can discover in conversation at the very least. I've never read any Habermas. Is Gary, right? Is that Gary Habermas? I've heard his name around. I've come across.
You have Gary Habermas, who's kind of the theologian, and then you want Julian, Jurgen Habermas, German. So there's two different Habermases.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I've read neither of them. Sure. So yeah. But I like that. I mean, I like that terminology, but it's pointing to something I agree with, that there's an element to the only real skill that we need, I think, to develop, at least in the present moment, is this capacity to communicate and trust in that communication. Like if we can generate that, then we can generate the basis upon which we rederive the values and rederive the possibilities to create those values.
No, what you're saying on trust, Francis Fukuyama, he has a book on trust, and basically a society without trust is doomed. We really can kind of underappreciate how much society requires trust to function, because it's like Heidegger's invisible doorknob. Like things work when you have it, so it becomes invisible, like water, like you're in the water, right? Also, like on what you're saying with money, when money becomes, it absolutely becomes primarily linguistical and negotiation, right? Like we negotiate it. Now, what's starting to happen, if I were to speak in America with inflation especially, but even before that, there's a sense in which people are starting to go, I do not experience a way of life that aligns with what I am being told about the value of the economy or the dollar. And so then people start to get upset. And if you take that too far, then you have social uprising, where people they uprise. So eventually, if there's a disconnect between the communication of the economy between that and your experience, then stuff gets crappy. That's when you can have sort of turmoil in different things. Whereas when you have, say, gold, the dollar that's, say, pegged to gold, there's a kind of experience you can go and look at gold, or be like, it is hard to find gold. And if the dollar is pegged to that, there is a foundation to it. Now, one would have to get into the debate on Keynes and Bretton Woods and all that, and I'm not meaning to do that. The main thing I'm trying to do is that if you say your currency is based on trust, which is what trust in the US dollar, which is mostly reflected in the bond market, then you are saying that it is based on a kind of experience, actually. You're saying in the future, you will experience a world where America is still stable. Or you are saying that America is a nation that if you went to, you would experience a government that maybe be dysfunctional, but overall is functional enough. It provides enough stability, right? So it's pegged to a sense of experience. Trust is always pegged to a sense of experience, on the kind of experience that you will have, right? Well, that means communities, for people to join, have to create trust. And they also have to communicate where you should put your trust. Because right now it can feel random to people. Let me try out this online community. Let me try this online one and find out. And then people get overwhelmed and exhausted and they're not sure what to do, right? Because there's this problem of communication. And what has to occur is a way to quickly communicate where people should invest and give them a sense of the kind of experience that they will have. And that experience cannot be reliant on a single source, a single leader, a single strongman. It has to be emergent, because then if it's emergent, then that it greatly increases the probability that you will have an experience amidst anyone in the community, as opposed to only if you're around the leader. right? Because what can happen would be like, oh, I got to be around the leader to have that experience, right? Well, if instead the aesthetic information you are receiving is a product of the community, that would greatly increase the probability that you just need to be in the community to have that experience, as opposed to just a say given individual. So, and therefore, here's the point with that: if the experience is probable at any location in the community, then you can better trust that if you put your time in that community, you will get a return on that time in the form of gain wisdom, gain horizon, and so on and so forth, right? Well, then, if that's the case, any sort of valuation of that community would be a product of that reliability and trustability of experience, not merely what you have been linguistically negotiated into assenting to, which then, of course, is far too speculative. And then that quality of experience, which say you would represent in the currency according to the system as you would so do, would then be reflected as you carried yourself in the world across the networks into other people. And therefore, you would be a reference point of that value that was created, in the same way that America's, when Americans go places, that's kind of in a way, they talk at ambassadorship, cultural, where you share people from different countries, because it becomes a kind of representative of the values of the nation that you come from, say if you do teaching in American different things. So likewise, people who are products of certain horizons or certain communities then become ambassadors, in a sense, of that value that was created, which further functions as evidence of that value to other people. And thus, the value represented in that currency is backed and assented to by other communities outside of it, because they see the product as it moves around the network. And so then it's not siloed, it's not tribal. It actually becomes represented by the kind of experience those people create for others as they move about in their daily lives. And all of that, the very fact that you can maintain that value while outside the community, then adds to the trustability of that value, because it is not contingent upon being surrounded by people like you, which would then mean it was fragile, right? So then you have a test to showcase the anti-fragility of that value. And all of this becomes more readily communicated because it is experience-based, not linguistically based, which would then ultimately be arbitrary or much more arbitrary. And then that's easily exploited by power. The people who then have power over the arbitrary system to add the zero to your $1,000 so that they can get $1 trillion or whatever. So by making, and then I'll give it back to you. So by making the foundation experiential, that in of itself has a check and balance system to fight against totalitarian centralization. But the problem has been lacking a method of communicating that effectively in an experiential way. And that, because then the scale, because then you have to invest a lot of time, right? And that expands the pace, right? And the moment you expand the pace, what is something we also said earlier? One of the reasons it can seem like you're not able to move the bookcase is because you have to pick it up and move it through time, right? So there's actually a feeling of pace that can coincide with a feeling of freedom. Like if I can just quickly move through my thoughts about the pen quickly, and that's why it's easy to feel free about it. Whereas picking up the bookcase and moving it through time feels like a lessening of freedom, right? Because I feel more determined. So likewise, if you actually are able to quickly determine the communities on that deep level, that will probably overall increase a feeling of freedom that people have in the overall system, right? They're going to feel more free. And when people are more free, it's easier to be intrinsically motivated. When you're intrinsically motivated, it's easier to value, which would then increase the effectiveness of the overall system to reverse entropy. So it then gets a lot of different feedback loops and a lot of different areas that would seem to me as if they would fight the entropic tendencies of the system, because it would change people on all these different levels.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm glad we agree. Let's do it.
Okay, sounds good. I'll see you. You want to go to Waffle House or IHOP? I can get,
yeah, no, I just got to hash out the details, and then, yeah, we'll sign on the dotted line and the thing is done.
There you go. Boom.
That was beautiful. Yeah, yes, you very well articulated much of why I feel like that is an important relationship. And So at the very least, I think we have to divide currency into two, at the very least.
Sure.
It might be more. I've been playing around with a third that I call something like a shadow token, which is trying to represent the proper the proper activation of trolling energy, say, parasitic energy, right? Because parasites are a functional aspect of a total ecological system.
Right.
They're a kind of mutualistic friction on growth, which also stimulates a deep interrelationship with the environment,
Right.
especially when it's mutualistic. Especially as, for instance, when I'm reliant upon a certain bacterial colony to do certain kinds of digestive processes, and then I call that, unbeknownst to me, part of myself. I think I'm doing it on my own, but I'm not. But so I think there's a way to, rather than having all of the functions of the whole system be generated by a single currency, which causes the different influences to be at odds with each other, right? For the value inversions to take place. I think you actually separate the currencies to define a particular domain, and then you make the act of the translation between those domains the deliberative act of the communal will.
Right.
So I can describe that as the process by which these things, there's an incubation aspect of the Metagora. It's you can think of it as a kind of standard incubator where people take their ideas and bring it into a small group setting, medium group setting, and then there are different tiers, different phases. So the first tier is just to build it up, is to kind of create a seed. Hardly any criticisms, and then once it's gone through and no one can add any more, then it goes up to the next, and then it's kind of criticized with regards to its relationship to the rest of the marketplace, and whether or not it's been done already, or how it might not be actually answering the solutions it claims to answer. And that is an iterative cycle. And then at some point, collectively, the community decides that that process has landed upon something which is of value to the external. Now, that act of deliberation on the inside is manifested by a kind of currency, a currency we call attention. Right. And that currency that we call attention is manifested by, if I look inside, kinds of currencies in the brain, right? Resources which manifest change in state, and that we have different types of currencies in the body. So there's metabolic processes, and then there are electrophysiological processes, and these act on different paces with different resources for those reasons. And if the resources were to compete with each other, that would be a bad thing, right? If I had to choose between using my muscle or using my imagination to figure out how I could use my muscle, then I'm kind of in a quandary.
Right.
And so the ability to figure out how it is we decide to act upon the virtualized abstraction attention domain and manifest it into the physical domain is the whole name of the game. And rather than tie those two domains with a singular currency, I think you have to have an internal currency at the very least and an external currency. So you have a localized currency and a marketplace currency. You cannot have full fungibility between the whole thing. And I do think you need this kind of shadow currency, but that's the most speculative part of this. In a sense, it's kind of like recreating puts and calls, right? It's like short and long. It's like you're doing different kind of stuff with regards to betting against things, and you want to know. You kind of want to know who's good at betting against things.
Yes, you do.
Because some people are really good at betting against things, and some people are really good at betting for things. And that's an actual skill that's manifested, a different kind of expertise, right? It's the convergent and the divergent, I think, interacting with each other. So I want to try to make all of that functionality with regards to the internal workings of our meaning-making systems, in terms of the kind of cybernetic operation between our internal states and the world around us. I want to make that explicit as much as possible, not because we have to be self-aware of it, but because we need to use that to generate patterns, which then will allow us to manifest that outward expression of self rather than that in returning, right? We're actually manifesting the product of our actions to the benefit of the whole network, and that in turn is fed by the other aspects of the network. And that should be good enough to just, completely rewrite the whole of human civilization and
Yeah,
get
I
us
think
past
that
the eye
I'll
of this
do it.
needle. And yeah,
So it'll be fine. We'll all be good, and then we can all have our pancakes at IHOP. So it'll be fine in peace. So it's going to work out. It is definitely the case of a few more things. Incredibly important to realize that economics communicates information. And one of the great problems right now is because the pricing mechanism is not very good at pricing horizons, precisely because it doesn't have that breakup that you described, nor is there a sense of the intrinsic versus the extrinsic. That's not a general sense, so it's not communicated by the system. The reason this is a problem is because if we naturally associate, say, something being worth $500 with having value that somehow corresponds with that, then all these communities are priced at zero. And so the market says, well, there's no value here, and therefore it doesn't cultivate these horizon abilities. Oh, wait, what did we say earlier? Without these horizon abilities, it's going to be difficult to have the intrinsic motivation, ergo to reverse entropy. If you don't have the right horizon and therefore identify with other, then you're going to close yourself off and create that entropic situation that we described. So horizons are a big, big deal. But right now, how do you know that a given horizon like Voicecraft is valuable? You've done it. So you've used your time to do it. Well, then you know. But the problem, of course, is communicating that value to people who have not done it, right? And to have it somehow reflected in an economic model that makes it sustainable. And that's really a lot of when we talk about the pricing mechanism of Horizon. Another way to think about that is a model of investment and sustainability. Not just simply how do we make money, but how do we keep the system functioning, and also using economic information to its advantage as opposed to as a barrier, right? Because if you can't price it, then that actually is it. Here's the thing that's very important. You actually cannot avoid the economic game of communication. You're in it already. You may not like to be in it, but you are in it, and therefore information is being communicated. And if you cannot be priced by the system or have a mechanism of financial exchange, then that sends information to the system that this is a hobby, right? And then likewise, that means horizons are a hobby. And if horizons are a hobby, then they surely cannot be a solution to technological capture. They surely cannot help us avoid the Gerardian apocalypse. Therefore, that possibility is discounted and you're in trouble, right? You have discounted the possibility of avoiding entropy. Therefore, entropy is destiny at that point, just about, right? So another way to look at this pricing problem of horizons is, in fact, to not be disregarded, so that horizons are not priced out of the market per se by not being priceable, and because you're already being communicated information. But then horizons, by definition, are a dialectic, if you grant me this term, between the intrinsic and the extrinsic, right? Between the environment and the internal, right? Well, that means there has to be two different economic mechanisms, right? Like where you're saying the internal operations of the community that then create this the emergent image or aesthetic experience, of which then can be externally priced or externally organized around, right? So you have to have two layers of operation to determine the investment and then to motivate people to maintain that investment so that the quality of the information that is given to the overall economy is high and effective. So that is how you have to think about it. But you see, one of the reasons why the current system, again, does not seem like it is effective at pricing this is because it doesn't have the split between the intrinsic and the extrinsic. There's two ways, the way I say it's either economic gnostic, there's like economic gnosticism, which tends to be that price is dirty and all that matters is value, or you have economic materialism, which is price is value. There's really not a difference for the economic materialist, right? So you have a lot of economic dualism, which, because dualism tends to turn into Gnosticism that then generates a reaction of materialism. And that's basically what has occurred. Whereas you need something like economic dialecticism, which of course would be, economic Hegelianism, which is a dialectic relation between value and price that is not trying to replace them, that sees them as unique, but they are always in a communicative interaction with one another. But that would require the individual to hold a space where value occupies the internal and price has the extrinsic role, and never shall the two replace one another. And that, though, requires a certain horizon to see the world as a place where economics must be thus, and to carry oneself as such. So to me, and then I'll give it back to you, the death of economic dualism would also be significant for this, what we are describing. If by dualism one means the thing that leads to Gnosticism or the thing that leads to materialism.
Well said. And I'm glad you brought up Voicecraft. Because as you said, my experience there has been one of a space, I guess initially invitationally defined by Tim Adlin. So and what I found there when I came into it, just by hearing his voice, right, hearing him speak. So we invited him into Discord community for John Vervaeke to have a Q&A, and that's where we bumped into each other. But what I heard, and I'll say, of course, that I have the same experience with you, is that there's a really an ineffable resonance, right? So it can't be reduced to a naming. I could try to explore what it is that I'm noticing, but there's something which is kind of undeniably resonant, and that has a lot to do with what we've been talking about here, which is defining the way a space relates to its external. So I've been very grateful for Tim and what he's done in that space, and I think what he's starting to create there as or what he's co-creating there is part of the tissue, right? It's a part of the differentiated structure of the whole. We need these different spaces that engage in different ways.
Absolutely.
At the very least, in the transitional sense, in order to get us into that communion with each other, that communication. And there are a number of communities that are like this. I mentioned him, but I've been spending a lot of time past year or so there. But individuals in particular are who I care not for the naming or the very particular shape of a space, but for the contents, let's say, of its character. And that's what I'm hoping to be true to, a true expression of our character, and not to have that be stifled by inappropriately influential market signals. So yeah, and here's to our children.
Here's to our children, Tyler.